So welcome this evening, and if you could just state your name for the record.
My name is Greg Henser. I'm a project manager with the New England District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I think we're getting the presentation queued up.
Okay.
For that presentation mode. Yeah. Excellent. So, yeah, thank you for having us this evening. The Army Corps of Engineers, collaboration with the RIDEM and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has done a lot of work out at Ninigret Park. So we're here to give you an update. Next slide, please. Just a general meeting agenda. Introductions. There are several of us here tonight. I'd like to present them. Just to give you a background about our program, work that we've done over the last few years. I'd also like to give just a general overview of work that we're planning to do this year and in 2025. Also, just for Ninigret planning and development, just so some of our concerns, we can talk about some things to be aware of. And then also, I think which kind of initiated this whole meeting was a question about environmental land use restriction, or ELUR, and the former tank farm, which used to be part of the air base. Next slide, please. So for introductions, again, my name is Greg Henser. I'm the incoming project manager for the New England District. I've been on this project for only a few months now. With me tonight is Carol Charette. She was on this project as a project manager for how many years? So since 2008, she was a project manager, and she's handing the baton to me. Tracy Dorgan, project geologist, no stranger to this council. I think he's given a few presentations here. Behind him, Nikki Brennan, Corps of Engineers. We also have, there's a lot of entities throughout the Corps of Engineers. We have to get support from some other districts. We have a center of excellence that just has like niche expert level folks that we reach out to. Next slide, please. Weston Solutions is a contractor for the Army. Mary Boggs back there, she drove down to Glastonbury, Connecticut to be with us. There's a lot of names. I'm not going to go through everyone. But finally, I do want to note that from Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, RIDEM, we have Nick Nunes, and then we also have Patricia Burke. Right next. Yeah. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview. Ninigret Park used to be the Charlestown Naval Auxiliary Landing Field. It operated and was pretty heavily used during the Second World War for pilot training. It's kind of a staging area for sending pilots over to the European theater. After the Second World War, it was operated by the U.S. Navy through the 1970s, mostly as kind of an overflow from Quonset Point. Next slide, please. In 1980, it was transferred from the federal government to the town for beneficial reuse. It, at that time, was split up essentially into two parcels. The northern parcel was given to the town. It's about 230 acres. The southern parcel is a little larger, 400 acres. It's a wildlife refuge that was given to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Both of them have unique CERCLA numbers through EPA. That way they can track their various sites. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the Army's FUDS program, formerly used Defense Sites Program. It is a program set up to do environmental investigation and remediation of former DoD properties. For instance, CNALF. There's like two sub-programs of it. One's called HCRW, which is essentially investigating chemical hazards. And then the second component is known as MMRP, which is to investigate munitions and explosions hazards. For efficiency, we're doing both concurrently at Ninigret Park. We follow the CERCLA process. CERCLA process was established by the US EPA under their Superfund program. It works. We follow it. It starts with a preliminary assessment and site inspection. Essentially, if we have a new site, we look at former uses, former features, what could have possibly been a potential for a spill. Then we do like a preliminary assessment, which is kind of like a presence absence of those chemicals to confirm whether or not a spill had occurred. And then it goes on to a next phase, which is the remedial investigation. That is essentially to characterize the nature and extent of a chemical release. If there was a chemical release, then we would go into a feasibility study, which is to look into remedial alternatives. It's not shown on the slide, but there's a proposed plan. So the next stage would be, the Army would go to the town, RIDEM, Fish and Wildlife, the general public. Here's our plan for correcting the problem. There's a public meeting. It's documented. We collaborate to come up with a solution that works for the stakeholders. That goes into remedial action. We do the work. There are some trailing phases of the circle process. For instance, if there were like a pump and treat system built to treat groundwater, that's probably going to operate for a number of years. So they call that remedial action operation, RAO phase. There's also a groundwater component to monitoring, which would be long-term management. I mean, that's just one component of long-term management, which would be monitoring groundwater to ensure that if groundwater has been remediated, that it maintains at levels that are safe. And then I also want to point out that at any point, this is just a process, like a big picture process, but at any point, if there's an imminent danger to human health or the environment, we can initiate interim actions. So in the Army jargon, they call that time critical removal action, of TCRA. At Ninigret Park, that's been implemented twice. In both instances, it was to install drinking water treatment systems. I guess their technical term would be point of entry treatment systems, or POET systems. Next slide, please. And we're going to go into that in more detail soon. I just listed a few of the major documents that we've prepared. I mean, there's a lot of documents, and I can't fit them all on a slide, but essentially a lot of the earlier work done in the 80s, 90s was performed by RIDEM and the US EPA, a lot of that SIPA stuff. The remedial investigation was broken up into several projects based on priority. We are closing up Project 8, and we're in the midst of Project 9. Again, we're going to go into that in a second. But Project 9, when we start a remedial investigation, we do come to the town to kind of let you know what we're up to, so the public was aware of what the Army's doing. We had a public meeting in 2020 and 2021. I think we've given some updates since then, and I'm here tonight just to provide you with another update. We do the work in accordance with a plan, work plan that is, reviewed by RIDEM and stakeholders. Next slide, please. On our team, we have human health and ecological risk assessments. We have them at the Army Corps of Engineers, our contractors. RIDEM also has them, that we look at the various chemicals that could be of concern. For instance, PFAS, been a hot topic for the last few years. Volatile organic compounds, particularly benzene, which is a chemical in that group of compounds. PCBs and several others. We look at various receptors or people who could be exposed to it. Was it recreational users? Is it employees at the park? Not just human, but also ecological, plants, animals, marine species, and then different exposure pathways and scenarios. For instance, consumption of untreated drinking water. If there's a worker exposure, doing work out there, we look at that risk, and we look at risk to, long-term exposure through plants and animals. And we also establish, as part of the RI phase, project action levels, PALs. And it's essentially derived from published and promulgated EPA standards. I've listed a bunch. Those are just a few of them. One of them's the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, which is the EPA standard for public drinking water. We screen our results against that. PFAS, BP does not currently have an MCL. They probably will in the future. But we do use the 2016 US EPA lifetime health advisory level. The EPA had that promulgated. The DOD adopted that, which is 70 parts per trillion. EPA since rescinded it, but DOD still adheres to that, awaiting further promulgation of standards from EPA. We do also screen our results to a more conservative Rhode Island RIDEM standard of 20 parts per trillion. And we're clearly, very much following the PFAS standards as they are very dynamic and been evolving as of late. Next slide, please. Remedial investigation, there's a lot of activities. We've been out there for quite a few years. Just to name a few activities, we do geophysical surveys to identify metallic anomalies that could help us kind of pinpoint where there might be munitions. We do test pitting to do visual inspection of potential munitions. We have had a ton of wells out there, 90 wells. So yeah, about 90 wells. We're also are rehabilitating some older wells that were installed before the Army's involvement to kind of bring those into our study. We do background sampling and testing of sediment soil to compare that to what's native to the area versus what's been potentially impacted by former DoD operations. And I think I'm going to give this presentation over to our project geologist, who's going to walk us through some of the details that we've been working on in the last year. So without further ado, Tracy.
Tracy Dorgan, Army Corps of Engineers. Don't know if that needs to be recorded again.
It does. Thank you.
Let me see if the pointer, it disappears on the screen. So my assistant, Nikki, is going to hopefully, let's go ahead to the next slide and see how this works. So we're pulling from a number, some of these figures you've seen, or folks who've attended the prior meetings have seen some of these. This is a compilation of drawings or figures that come from prior presentations or work plans. This figure is showing you a collection of sites that are approximated with ovals and cross-hatching. Hopefully it's visible. Greg has mentioned there's a Project 8 and Project 9. Those project numbers relate to a document that authorizes the FUDS program to move forward. So Project 8 is broken into 3 of the former boiler houses, as well as a transformer vault, or former transformer vault. So these projects were initiated by the Corps as far as remediation. Underground storage tanks were removed, the boiler houses were demolished. The bulk of the work was executed in the 1990s, early 2000s. But because of a lack of formal site closure, there was an additional phase of confirmation sampling that occurred in the 2001-2002 timeframe. The findings of that work led to the conclusion that there are no remaining hazards at site, chemical hazards, from the DoD activities at the former boiler houses. So those projects have been formally closed. The transformer vault, that is one of the projects that is going to be moving forward in the near future this spring for the complete removal, excavation of the concrete vault, which is subgrade, and the residual petroleum and low-level PCB contamination that is within the vault itself. So that will be removed this spring. The projects that are to the south in this image represent the Project 09 sites. So let's see, Nikki, moving from east, Charlestown landfill. Is that approximate area? It's shown as a distinctly different area than Eastern Area Landfill. However, there's some question as to whether those are actually completely separated or whether they're slightly interconnected and represent one irregularly shaped landfill, to be determined. The Ninigret Wildlife Refuge landfill is furthest to the south. And those three landfills represent three known Navy landfills. Each of those, and this will be touched on in a follow-on slide, represent both HTRW projects, as Greg was mentioning, as well as MMRP projects. So we are, in one effort, attempting to evaluate the chemical hazards as well as the physical hazards from military munitions. And that is because in 2008, an SI, following that CERCLA process that was shown, a specific investigation was done for military munitions projects at CNOW. There are more military munitions projects at CNOW than these three. But these three, because we are evaluating them from a chemical hazard perspective, in an effort to be more efficient, we are trying to evaluate them from both program perspectives in one effort. If that's, hopefully that's cool. The last of the Project 09 sites is referred to as the burn pit area, which is just south of former runway 30, right there. And in its name, former burn pit, you could also refer to as fire training area, which is where military aircraft and perhaps other objects such as vehicles that were no longer desired in use would have been taken to this area, intentionally lit on fire, and then intentionally put out. So the Navy personnel that were based here had to stay trained and certified to respond to an actual aircraft emergency or fire. And to do that, they had to stay current and trained. So they would intentionally have training fires, they would put those out. We understand from direct interview information, as well as other aerial photo interpretation and geophysics, numerous of the aircraft and vehicles that were burned at the fire training area, once they were burned and they became really unrecognizable, they were then dragged off to the landfills. So we know that each of the three landfills contains at least aircraft components. Next slide, please. This figure is an attempt to show you, and I know it can be a little bit tricky, it's to give you a sense of, in the legend, they're referred to as MRF numbers, 1 through 7. These represent all of the known military munitions projects. These were evaluated in the SI. A number of these projects are recommended to go forward into an RI. The three landfills, which have unfortunately slightly different names in the military munitions program, those are the three landfills. So when you see Hunter Island dump site, MRS-3, that equates approximately to the Eastern Area Landfill. Inland Toxic Waste Dump, which is an unappealing name, corresponds to the Ninigret Wildlife Refuge landfill. So that will be a little more clear. But the point of this slide that we wanted to share is that there are other known MMRP projects which in the future will be moving forward to the RI phase, but currently are on, think of it as a back burner. We know they exist. These documents have been shared with the community. They're available in the public record. They've been shared with the town. So these potential hazards exist, but they are on a back burner. We are prioritizing from essentially a risk-based perspective. We are targeting what we believe to be potentially higher risk to human health or environment projects. Next slide. So geologic conditions, I'm a geologist, so it's felt that we should share a little of this. I won't bore you to death, or I'll attempt not to bore you to death. Example photo on the left shows one of the drill rigs that folks who were in the park in the last 1 to 2 years probably have heard and seen these rigs. But this gives you an example of our work area when we are collecting subsurface information, soils data, depth and consistency or the type of bedrock, and also installation of monitoring wells. The image on the right, this is the sand and gravel pit that's just due north of the park. It's just information from a boring represents something on the order of 4 inches in diameter. So we try and interpret to the best of our ability what's going on in the subsurface from a 4-inch diameter example of the world. This is an enormous exposure of the subsurface, which is very convenient, gives us a good sense of what materials are, the range of grain size. Key takeaway here is highly pervious, so the water will move through it rapidly. Highly pervious sands and gravels, hobbles, all the way up to boulders, which is a little hard to see in the picture, but the white pickup truck, you can see a collection of boulders that are equal in size to the pickup truck that have been just parked in one location. They didn't all get naturally deposited there. That's where the bulldozer parks them to get them out of the way. As we're drilling in the subsurface, we are having to drill through the cobbles, and sometimes the larger boulders, and attempt to divine or determine whether it is the top of actual bedrock or just another 10-foot boulder. So that adds to some of the challenges that we face. There are some other bedrock or overburden types. There's a glacial till deposit here. Really all that equates to is a less pervious unit. It doesn't move water and potentially contaminants as readily as the more pervious sands and gravels. But that overburden mixture represents the groundwater aquifer that are used by many, but not all, of the drinking water wells in Charlestown. The bedrock beneath that also represents a key aquifer. Some people's drinking water wells are deeper and are screened completely in bedrock. Some of the wells are completely screened in the sand and gravel above. They have different geochemical signatures, and that's something that plays into our evaluation. Next slide. So this is a little more zoomed in image, trying to show you the former boiler houses and transformer vault. This is Project 08. Again, the boiler house projects at this point are completed, and the remaining work to be done this spring, the underground electrical vault, which served basically the lighting for the airfield, which the town has not used, does not use, and in coordination with the town, the decision was made to go ahead and completely remove that concrete vault just to get it out of the way. So that is work that should be happening. Next slide. This is a very cartoonish conceptual site model of that transformer vault, just for a mental picture. There's literally a manhole used to have, and it may still have a boulder sitting on top of it. So there's a boulder which we use to keep people from coming and going in that concrete vault. It is dry. There's never been water found inside the vault other than small residual rainwater when the manhole was found broken. So our intention is to completely remove that concrete chamber, which is approximately 8 feet below ground. Once it is out of the way, we will collect confirmation soil samples from surrounding it to determine whether any contamination, which is known to exist on the floor in that concrete box. There is some petroleum and PCB contamination, but it appears currently to be contained within the concrete wall. We're going to collect confirmation soil samples. If contamination is found outside the vault, then we will be removing that sort of contamination as well and pursue that until we find we've gotten all that contamination, and then we will backfill the hole and leave the town with essentially a backfilled usable space. I see what looks like a question. Feel free, if there are questions, feel free to ask as we go. No? Everybody good? Next slide, please. Project 09. So this is the slide where we're trying to show you the matchup between the HDRW program and the MMRP program. So this is that MRS Hunter Island dump site, for example, matches with in the Project 09 we refer to as Eastern Area Landfill, giving you an approximate acreage. These acreages, just for your awareness, these are based on aerial photo interpretation over time. So an air photo interpretation shows some disturbance of the land, some type of land filling, or debris that is seen. So it encompasses that acreage. When we go into the field, for example, we've been focusing our work currently at Charlestown, 13 acres. That 13 acres, based on air photo analysis or other maps, we believe is a landfill. That doesn't mean that the entire 13 acres is a uniform package of the same kind of material. So that is part of the goal of the RI, is to determine what is the nature of the fill. It could be simply reworked sand, gravel, and boulders that were just placed in an area. And it may represent no environmental hazards. There may be focused areas within it that are very different. So that is the purpose of the RI. Let's see. Project 09, down at the bottom, that last bullet, includes an evaluation of both on-site and off-site nearby drinking water wells. So the 09 project includes the water supply well area. So this project has a distinction in the FUDS program as the first in the FUDS program to be authorized to evaluate PFAS contaminants. Because of its site history, because of the dates of DOD use, and the confirmation through coordination with the town that the town has not placed any material or added to anybody's knowledge materials that contain PFAS. So for example, had the town been using and doing fire training out here in more recent days that included firefighting foam, that would be a concern, but there's no record. So we were authorized to evaluate the town's drinking water wells at the park and a subset of off-site private wells that we believed are potentially down gradient or at risk. Based on the findings of that initial sampling, we confirmed that PFAS was present, and so we are now authorized to complete a complete RI looking for all sources of PFAS contamination, which we don't know what that number is. We have to try and back our way into it using data to guide us. So we use the concentrations of PFAS that are found in the monitoring wells as well as the supply wells to try and backtrack our way into areas where the PFAS had been released. Next slide. So these colored areas are, again, this is Project 09, a little more refined than the oval crosshatch shapes that we saw in the earlier figures. Again, showing you Charlestown landfill in green, Eastern Area landfill, aka Hunter Island dump, in brown. And it's worth knowing, Hunter Island dump, when you go to that area, park your car and go for a walk on the nature trail, you're walking on what used to be an island. When this space was first constructed, that was a standalone island in Ninigret Park. Over the evolution of the Navy base construction, fill of some nature was placed into Ninigret Park, enough to make a causeway for the Navy to be able to drive trucks in a loop, making it a landfill. And then the interior components of what had been Ninigret Park were filled in with Navy refuse. Let's see, the yellow, large yellow triangle represents the water supply well area. This is an earlier work plan figure based on the data that we've been collecting. That shape has been updated or is being updated and modified. But it constitutes a focus area based on the initial data collection, such as the Seafood Festival well, the Navy, what we refer to as the Navy well, the Beach Pavilion well, and so forth. You can see the blue area to the south, Ninigret Wildlife Refuge landfill, and the purple rectangle is the burn pits. Next slide. Another conceptual site model for the burn pit. So airplane, lighted on fire, practice putting it out. The residual is visible on the ground surface. If you were to take a walk over into this area, you will see melted aircraft aluminum, shredded aircraft parts laying on the ground, and the soils don't really grow vegetation very well, what we refer to as stress vegetation. So you can see evidence of this. We can see through air photo analysis that multiple areas were utilized over time. So we've been collecting soils and subsurface soils and groundwater data, try and evaluate the chemical impacts from this activity by the field. The conceptual site model, it does show you our estimated approximate depth of the water table. At the time of the work plan from which this drawing came, the bedrock depth is unknown. It's believed to be something deeper than 23 feet. Based on the work we've completed in the last year, we know that in places it's as much as 60 and 65 feet below ground surface. Next slide. These are some photos showing you what I was just describing. Drill rigs and Weston, our consultant, out in the field collecting a variety of data. The oval, it's a little difficult to see, but there's a rusted metal vertical pipe. That well was installed in the early 1990s. The initial data from that showed there was not high levels of contamination that were considered at that time. Subsequently, the data appears to show us that that well is located very close to a known PFAS hotspot. The debris on the ground in front of that well is metal, slag, and aircraft components. Next slide. This is a draft figure showing concentration contours. So cooler colors represent lower concentrations, warmer colors, higher concentrations. Don't know if you can point it out. Well, CN5, the one well target in the center next to the orange, that is that rusty metal pipe that was installed in the 90s. You see the orange or the higher concentrations seem to be centered on that area of metal slag that is seen on the ground surface. You can also see the concentrations appear to extend in a lobe off to the right in this image, headed towards that ponded water area. So at the time of this activity, this used to be a runway. This was the original segment of paved runway surface. There are residual asphalt fragments still remaining out there. And so the way that controls to some degree migration of precipitation, as well as any of the flammable materials that would have been placed onto the aircraft during the training fires, and then the runoff from those activities. These are things that we are sensitive to and we're tracking for environmental contaminant distribution, especially as it may be moving towards surface water features and different ecological habitat. Next slide. This is similar concentration. Again, this is draft data. It's highlighting simply that the subsurface data, and I didn't mention this, but surface soil samples represent the upper 1 foot, everything from ground surface to 12 inches. This represents 12 inches down to what we call the smear zone, which is somewhat variable. The water table is at about 8 to 10 feet below ground, but the soils, we wanted to capture chemistry because the water table can vary depending on whether it's a wet season or a dry season. So this represents concentrations in steepings that can be 15 feet. But again, showing a pretty consistent pattern. The higher, we appear to have one pretty distinct deposit.
Carol, I hate to say this, but can you come to the microphone because they can't pick you up on the camera? You have to come to the microphone.
I'd have to read it off the legend at this point, but you can, we're trying to indicate the concentrations. Yeah, that's, if we get to the next slide, I think it'll be a little more helpful. So this next slide, this represents, and this is a very working draft that was given to a presentation to headquarters for the Corps of Engineers a number of months ago. So the blue lines represent groundwater contours. The orange polygon shape, I cartooned that on, estimating. You can see a line of wells, which, Nikki, you might have to point where the wells are that we have more recently installed. But there's a number of wells, both up gradient and down gradient, of what is known to be, the burn pit site. We have a very distinctive plume, higher concentrations with pretty steep concentration gradients that are emanating from that hotspot area that was shown in the soils concentrations, which appears to be migrating down hydraulic gradients away from the release area.
Which direction is that in?
It's north is up on this image. Thank you for asking. So it's moving generally to the south. There is some uncertainty. You can see the blue lines are somewhat radial. And once we get outside our well network, the confidence level in groundwater direction gets a little uncertain. That's a data gap that will be filled in future work, especially where we will be adding additional monitoring wells as well as staff gauges to surface water features, because the groundwater to surface water interaction at this site is definitely occurring. So there could be nuanced differences to these groundwater gradients, and that's something we're focused on in the future work.
And is that part on the Fish and Wildlife property?
Yes, all of this site is on Fish and Wildlife property. This was one of my personally higher risk concern sites because of its site history, activity, what I could see on the ground surface, and to some degree because it's closer to public supply wells. So the Frosty Drew supply well, straight line distance is not very far away. But in the plus column, the Frosty Drew supply well is in hydraulically up gradient direction. So this site is on Fish and Wildlife, and it is hydraulically down gradient from all of the town's supply wells. Yes.
What is the depth of that plume?
Uh,
Give or take.
It extends all the way down. We have wells that go to the top of bedrock, and we have a small number of wells that extend into the bedrock. So right now, we are showing, and not to get too deep in the weeds, but if you were to look at those white chem boxes, you see there's an A, B, and a C in some places, and most places just an A and a B. A represents a water table well, shallow overburden. The B represents a deeper well, which is set just above the top of bedrock. We feel more confident that we are close to a release or a source area because not only do I have the soils data, but the groundwater wells show that the higher concentrations here are highest in the water table wells, shallow. And there's only one other place at CNOF currently, which I'll get to, that shows us that signature. At most of the other wells, the reverse is true. Those shallow wells appear to be relatively lower concentration PFAS, and the higher concentrations are deep in many of the water supply well monitoring wells.
Is this all that, the sand and gravel area as well?
Yes, this is highly pervious, except where the fire training activity occurred. The ground in many places is not only metal fill, but kind of between the asphalt that was heated and kind of glued together. It's got a different signature, but as soon as you get through that material, you're into sand and gravel.
Well, the reason I ask it looks like, based on these gradients, just from, well, this anecdotally, but if the burn pit's there, the runway activities were there, and if they used acme snow-forming foam while they were spraying in that direction, especially the high-pressure streams that they were using for aircrafts, it almost, literally, the plume starts to look like where you have the residuals of those sprays and then the runoff as they went down and into that soil that you spoke of, especially with the shallow depth. It's interesting.
And if this were an active airfield and they had been using AFFF foam last month, we would see probably a different appearance to this, because we do have monitoring wells on the north or up gradient side of that area as well as down gradient side. But we know from the site use, the site activity, this site has not been actively used in over 30 years. So with passage of time, highly pervious sand and gravels, precipitation and snow melt, the chemical data shown both in the soils and the groundwater, it appears the bulk of the plume and the higher concentrations are migrating to the south. Next up. So jumping to the landfills, Charlestown landfill, and we don't have a similar cartoon for all three of the landfills because they are similar-ish. So this was our conceptual model. As you can see, we are aware that Ninigret Pond is present, not just relative to Charlestown landfill, but all three of the land. There's freshwater and marine wetlands present at all three of the landfills. So you folks are the local residents, you're well aware, if we get a very large storm, tropical depression or a hurricane, you can see significant flooding that can put brackish or salt water up into areas for a time period. And then as the water recedes, you get freshwater recharge again. But it leaves a brackish signal to the soils. And that's a challenge that we're going to have to face as we're doing our investigations. The brown areas indicate just fill. We don't know the precise depths of the fill in places. That's part of the RI process. We don't know the precise nature of the fill, whether it represents inert native materials that were just moved and placed in different areas, or whether it represents buried drums that may contain contaminants still. But you can see we've got some cartoonish bombs and rocket symbols laying on the ground surface. That was not, those were known to be present and found during the SI phase. So during the RI phase of work, we have gone back to the known 1,000-pound bombs, found to be inert scrap material, just a bomb casing, and those were evaluated and have been removed from the ground surface. We have not excavated into the subsurface to go look yet for where any of the military munitions may reside. That is work that is in the future. And it is guided by the surface geophysics that Greg alluded to. Let's see, so this gives you a sense, water table flowing towards wetlands and towards the ocean in the form of Ninigret Pond, overburden, and bedrock, and both aquifers are being evaluated with monitoring wells. Next slide. So a couple of example photos. These are Charlestown landfills, looking at kind of both, looking at the landfill from two different perspectives. The upper right image shows monitoring wells being constructed with a drill rig just behind a little cluster of trees. In the upper left, you'll see the residential home. This is one of the homes on the Arnolda Association. The photo of the nice looking lawn on the left, that is taken from that same home from the patio, looking towards the landfill with Ninigret Pond in the background. The thing labeled fill mound, that it's hard to appreciate from here, but that is a highly irregular surface. They've amazingly been able to maintain a very nice lawn on top of it. We've collected geophysics on top of that, and that is buried metallic debris of some sort. Could be old truck frames, or it could be rum containers, or up. We don't know yet. It appears that in some places, the extent of the Charlestown landfill certainly comes right to the property line, and in some places may extend slightly over what we thought to be the property line. So as you can envision, if you are a sailor for the Navy back in whatever year, 60, if your job is to take something out to the landfill and get rid of it, you probably don't have a surveyor showing you where the property line is. If your job was to drive the bulldozer and push, you pushed. And in some places, it may have pushed over what is now essentially the property line. That is a data gap to be evaluated in the RI effort.
So, Mr. Dorgan, has anybody tested to see if that could be a munitions area, that mound there?
Not currently. It is planned for the future. Yes, sir.
So what potential munitions are potentially buried here? Because we've been hearing this from around town, munitions being buried in the property.
So
I think people would like to know what potential of those are.
sure. It appears to run a gamut from small arms. We know that small arms considered ammunition in the form of 30 caliber, 50 caliber machine gun rounds to 20 millimeter cannon shells, up to practice bombs, and the practice bombs that were removed, and I think we've got a later slide with a photo of one of them, was a 1,000-pound bomb casing. Not a live bomb, but a bomb casing. So it's a wide gamut.
I don't believe there was any actually 1,000-pound bombs used here, correct?
That I don't know.
to follow up,
I
but
mean, I think the locals would have known if they were dropping 1,000 pound bombs. But
yeah.
Right, and they would not be dropping 1,000-pound bombs here. However, the munitions would have been loaded on the aircraft. They would have been flown. They would have been flown to practice areas to actually drop ordnance, live ordnance. So keep in mind with the site history, World War II is when this base was built. This
where
base
was the
was,
practice basis from here for that?
there were a number of ranges. Carol, I know that you're familiar with at least a number.
Carol, I hate to do it to you, but
Practice bombing ranges on Martha's Vineyard, which were also part of our projects that we have cleaned up. That came straight from Quonset Point or even Charlestown.
have we found any paper trail? Like any documents that show that there were actually live munitions here at any point in time?
I would have to refer back and check it's called an ASR report and the Military Munitions SI report, I believe dated 2008, would detail that. But I can assure you live small arms have been found by the public, are routinely found by the public,
Oh, yeah.
and are turned into your police department. There's going to be a photo of my hand holding a couple of 50 caliber rounds that have been dropped off from some unknown location that the public has found at the park.
And that's the one thing that we heard from, just real
I know
quick,
that
from the
Carl
locals.
told me this afternoon that he found a single, what was it, 38? A single, somewhat corroded 38 caliber pistol round next to the beach pavilion.
And people have been finding like the small casings and stuff from, military police or whatever, carrying that kind of stuff. I'm more talking about the larger bomb issue.
Yeah, bombs are scary sounding.
Yes.
Now the shooting butt, is that where they did they would raise the tail of the plane up and then shoot into the mounds?
Correct. That was one of the MRS sites, is referred to as the shoot-in butt. It's a great name. And that is where the aircraft would have taxied out after some amount of maintenance, and they would jack the tail of the aircraft up to simulate horizontal flight. They had a backstop that was the target, and they would fire the guns to make sure they were functioning properly, and they would calibrate the guns to merge at a set point for the pilot.
Yeah, I've dug through one of them.
Okay, so,
I had some lead.
and that is likely from anecdotal information I've been told, that is a location where live 50s and 20 millimeters have been found. But that is on, and this is the public, but that is on U.S. Fish and Wildlife property, not town of Charlestown property, but it is part of the overall park.
Has there ever been, not the small arms mission, to this date, do we know, has there ever been a live high yield ordnance, like 1,000-pound bomb or any bomb that's
Technically,
live found on the property?
technically 20 millimeter and larger is considered HE,
Yeah,
and 20 millimeter live pieces have been found.
from the remains of the guns. But I mean, bomb wise, has there ever been a
Not
live
to my knowledge.
that we know of?
Not to my knowledge.
One other question.
Yes, sir.
Where is the car dump? The old cars,
The car
the abandoned cars.
dump, is that what you said?
Yes.
I've not been told that there's only one. I'm aware, I can tell you Charlestown landfill has got an old Jeep frames, and most of a Jeep sticking out of a slope. I know that numerous automobiles were deposited along access roads leading to the Ninigret Wildlife Refuge landfill. I'm not aware of a distinctive car dump.
Okay.
If you are, we'd love
There
to
is.
know it.
There is. I'm not sure if it's still there, but there was. When I was younger, I used to crawl through that park. There was,
If
there was a
you
local
know where
historian
it's
guy.
purely cars, I'd love to know it, because if that's
Oh,
not
it was
bombs
like
and
10 or-
drums, I'd like to know that.
And there was like, I don't know, 10, 15 cars all. What it was is the airmen would get stationed there and they would drive here, and then they would
Deploy.
get sent out and they'd leave their car.
Yes.
And would drag the car off to the woods, and there's a clump of cars in the Fish and
I'm
Wildlife.
told the same thing, I've been told anecdotally that Quonset Point, a bigger base with more airmen, if Captain whoever got tired of looking at all those old jalopies out there, the order went out, get rid of them. I'm told many of them came here.
Oh, sure.
Anecdotal.
Yeah, wow. That would explain why there's so many. It was a good sized clump. I mean, there's not much left of them now. 'Cause they're
That could have been
rotting.
it. The Quonset cleanup, perhaps. I don't know.
Hmm.
Okay, next slide. Okay, here you go. So these are some of the potential physical hazards. Image on the right, those are two 50 caliber rounds. The one with the black tip, that's an armor piercing round. At least one of them has got a head stamp, Lake City, 1943. We've received other anecdotal information of similar 50 caliber rounds that are visible in the shallow waters right off at least Charlestown landfill. The middle image, that is the 1,000 pound bomb casing, only contains sand. But for scale, the yellow stick looking object, that is a metal detector, and it is 3 feet long just for scale. And I forget the precise number, I believe 5 or 6 of these were removed in the last 2 years. The image on the left showing you a couple of 55-gallon drums. There's actually a total of 13 55-gallon drums. They still have labels so that we can be aware of what they once held. TCE, which is a chlorinated solvent. And you can see from the condition of the drums that they contain square pickaxe or fire axe penetrations on the bottom, which is likely how the solvents were released, potentially in that location or potentially somewhere else.
And are those drums on the Fish and Wildlife property?
Yes, they are. Next slide. Charlestown landfill. So we do not have time to go into all of our current findings, and the data is still being evaluated. But I wanted to give you a preliminary sense. So this is, every one of those white boxes is giving you concentrations in parts per trillion of PFAS. So we're simply highlighting PFAS currently in this image. Again, the blue contour lines represent groundwater contours. It's a pretty busy figure, I understand. But you can see focus areas where, based on multiple lines of evidence, historic air photos, maps, surficial observations, we believe the extent of the landfill is and is being evaluated. We have installed a large number of wells. We've sampled those wells now twice. We're highlighting here the PFAS concentrations because predominantly that appears to be the leading concern at this time. You can also see we're directly adjacent to the Arnolda Association properties. Nikki, if you can point out the former Braves house. It's under MW15. The house itself is under the chem box. So that's somebody's home. That's the home that had the nice lawn with the irregular mound of fill. So that is that property line that's somewhat in question as far as the extent of the landfill.
Mr. Dorgan, it's
Yeah.
hard to see from here. Nikki, do you mind just kind of like drawing a line with your finger there where the boundary is between Arnolda and the town's property? The
That,
red line? Okay, thank you.
right. And this property line gets a little convoluted. Where it is, I believe there may be an error on this figure. Where the town's property line is versus the U.S. Fish and Wildlife property is a little bit in question. Is it a straight line? Okay. There are, Fish and Wildlife has clearly denoted where their property line is. When you move to the next residence towards Ninigret Pond, you can walk through where they're currently mowing it on the residence side. As soon as you penetrate into the vegetation, you'll see warning signs that you're on U.S. Fish and Wildlife property. Okay.
You guys resurveyed this property at any point, or is that in a future?
We have surveyed monitoring wells and other data collection points, but we have not done a meets and bounds property line survey.
Is
at this
that
point.
in a future, part of the future project plan, especially if you have these
If
questionable areas?
potentially, yes, potentially. At this point, we're still evaluating nature and extent of the fill, so things that we refer to as data gaps are going to pop up, many of them, and we will attempt to fill the critical data gaps. Some data gaps may get postponed to a later phase of the work. If a remedial action is required, then it may get delayed to a later point. Trying to think of other key information, but simply want to make you aware. We're aware of the landfill, numerous activities, the extent of the landfill, the nature of the materials in the landfill. It is not all one ubiquitous uniform package. We're also keenly aware that these are people's homes and their drinking water. So every home and every building in Charlestown, there is no public water supply. So every building represents not only a well, but also a septic system. That comes to bear with PFAS compounds, because you can pump the PFAS up in your well, use the water, and dispose of it to a septic system. And that may be changing vertical depths that the contamination is located at. And it may also commingle PFAS compounds. There are over 3,000 different PFAS compounds. They are in many products that are probably in this room or on clothing right now. That's somewhat waterproof, guaranteed. It's got PFAS within the fabric. So those products that people use in their homes that get flushed down to the septic system represent another source of PFAS compounds which are being released back to the groundwater. So it makes it a very complex issue to evaluate and determine what is coming from the DoD attribution versus some other offsite potential sources. That is something that we are looking at, we're aware of. So far, the bulk of the PFAS detections at all of the sites have been fairly well constrained to PFOA, one type of PFAS compound. So that in some ways makes it actually helpful for us. It's got a pretty distinctive fingerprint if you think of it that way.
What would be the source of that typically?
It appears to be AFFF foam from DoD activity currently.
So because I'm not an expert on PFAS, are there certain components that break down within those based on, like versus what would come out of
Right. They
leaking
would,
products versus the DoD?
sure. If there was a more modern release, we would expect it to have a different chemical fingerprint. So it may not be a unique single compound or dominated heavily by this one compound. And so far to date, we have not seen different signatures, if that helps.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Excuse me, if you're going to ask a question, you need to go to the microphone and state your name.
Bonnie Van Slyke, Narrow Lane. I've just wondered what the red dotted areas are. Yeah, there's one there. They're all over the place.
Yeah, can you read the legend lower right?
Tracy, can you just repeat that
Right.
into the microphone?
Sure. They're simply trying to indicate areas of mounted materials or piles. So physical evidence of landfilling activities. With the nature of landfills, some places there may have been an effort to cover a landfill for one reason or another, to just simply level the ground or regrade to make it more workable. Other times we see evidence of mounded materials, and it's clearly evidence that, it's not a natural feature. It's evidence of landfilling activities of some sort. What the nature, it could be a pile of boulders, it could be a pile of drums. But as the investigation is going on, detail was made. I don't want to drag this out too long, but the initial work here, because of military munitions potential, we had unexploded ordnance experts who were making first evaluation of the site before we went in with land clearing equipment out of a pure safety perspective. That initial set of eyes on the ground, if they were finding things like 1,000-pound bomb casings, they would mark on maps where were these found, whether it was an old car frame, a drum, does the drum have labels, or is it a 1,000-pound bomb to be evaluated? So some of the investigation can be very complex. They can require drill rigs to drill and install wells and collect very, very precise analytical data. And some things are just very commonsensical obvious. We took a walk and we saw a thing. We took pictures and notes of what the labels were on the drums and the containers, and that's very powerful information. So it's a busy figure and it's got a lot going on. Yes, sir.
So far in all the drilling that's been done, they haven't hit anything that classified as ordnance.
No. Next slide. So jumping, you'll see much less busy eastern area landfills, aka Hunter Island dump site. You will see there are some data points shown on here. There are existing wells, now very rusty, from original PA and SI level work. There will be future investigations here, but we have not begun the bulk of our investigations on this land. There are some pretty unique observations here. If you point out a couple of the notes of the buried aircraft. Right, there's a number of black text in the number of places here. This is the only project I've ever worked on where we had the benefit of somebody having actually mapped and documented precisely what aircraft or aircraft components are located because they previously had been excavated or evaluated for potential removal. So we know that these aircraft parts are there. We also know that at least some of those aircraft parts were taken there after the fire training activities. Hence, each of the landfills is being evaluated for PFAS, not only the burn pit site. So not only the aircraft that may have been burned using AFFF foam, but potentially the drums and containers of spent AFFF foam may have come to the landfill. So we are evaluating the landfills as well for PFAS compounds. But the bulk of the investigation work at this landfill has not yet begun. We have done surface geophysics, UXO sweeps and clearing, but we have not executed the bulk of the drilling or test pitting and soil sampling here yet. That's
Any
in
idea when you plan on starting that one?
2024? Yes.
This year?
Yes. Next slide, please. Similar, Ninigret Wildlife Refuge or the inland toxic waste dump. Bit more intensive investigations done originally. There were some geophysical surveys represented by the blue rectangles. You'll see a number of soil samples were collected and a small number of wells. And this site, and we didn't show the conceptual site model, but this represents, and Nikki, you can show the road leading out to it. For original base construction, that road that goes out and makes a small cul-de-sac, this was the high explosives magazine for the airfield, for the Navy. So in the center of that cul-de-sac is a small elevated mound of earth within which is a concrete walled hut. And that is where the high explosives munitions were stored, intentionally a long way away from anything else. That way, if there were an accident, we could limit the damage. It appears that the Navy, after, or maybe concurrent with, or after its use, it became a convenient place to drive out and get rid of stuff. Landfill. It appears from the distribution of the material, and think about it, if you were given the task of go get rid of today's trash, drove out the good road to the cul-de-sac road, you backed up somewhere off the road in the low-lying areas and you dumped your stuff. And then that stuff was then pushed out and spread away from the road because you wanted to keep the road usable for the future. So it essentially has resulted in a circular pattern of fill. Within the center of it, we still have the high explosives magazine, which is not landfill. The magazine itself is just a structure within the ground, but in a circular halo around the cul-de-sac, essentially, is a ring of landfill material which was pushed into a wetland. So while initial work was done here, the bulk of the recent remedial investigation activities have not yet occurred, other than some initial site clearing, site inspection for visual features, and surface geophysics. The bulk of that work is 2024 as well, and later. Next slide, please. Jumping to the water supply well area, which we love acronyms. I sometimes slip with it. I might call it WSWA, water supply well area. This is an earlier image, so it's showing you, again, blue lines are groundwater flow direction. A feature of interest I want to point out is how they wrap around Little Ninny Pond. So Little Ninny Pond in the center of this image, that's what everybody refers to it now. That's what it's called after it became a park. Its original name for the Navy when the base was built was the Fire Pond. It was built as the fire source of water, conveniently located in both the petroleum tank farm site and the flight line fueling area. For obvious reasons, they wanted to have ready source of water to fight fires. It is a constructed pond to some degree. There may have been a natural feature there at some point. I can't find any record of it, but for base construction, this pond was dug to be a source of water. The pond is fed from all the paved surfaces to the northwest, have got stormwater runoff features which feed into the pond in two locations. On the southern end of the pond, there is an constructed invert so that if water levels get excessively high, it can drain out through that invert, and then it drains out to the southeast and then drains off to the south, passing very close to the burn pit project. So, Brad, thank you. So this pond acts as a control on groundwater contours. At certain times of the year, the pond has got a higher elevation than the local groundwater. And so the pond can act as a recharge source locally to groundwater, especially because every time it rains, it's receiving this runoff from all the paved surfaces feeding into it. At other times of the year, if it's very dry, that relationship can reverse. So we've studied this fairly well during petroleum tank farm work earlier on, because the petroleum tank farm site, the wells you see CN12, CN13, those blue dots near the center, those are at the former petroleum tank farm project. So we did quite a bit of groundwater monitoring there and evaluating Little Ninny Pond from potential petroleum impacts to the pond from that site. So this relationship of how the pond and the local groundwater is working is pretty well understood from that effort. So that comes to bear for the water supply well effort, because the plume, depending on where the PFAS releases occurred, to a large degree will be controlled by groundwater directions, groundwater gradients, but can also be controlled to some degree by stormwater management systems. So if we have man-made swales, depressions in the ground that are intended to carry flow away, those are important to us. If we have storm drain networks, which are designed to carry and manage surficial runoff of both water or potentially foam releases, those are important to us. So all of these are factors that we're taking into account. I wanted to point out, just so everybody is aware, it's difficult to see, and Nikki might have to point to the light green well targets. If you want to start to the north, actually go up top to RW3. That's the gatehouse. So this is near the entrance to the park. RW5, called the bike track pavilion, is also very close to the tennis court. So a lot of people think it was the tennis court pavilion, which is actually a year-round well. Some of these wells are year-round, some of these are seasonal. The Navy well, that is a seasonal well. It's only used for festivals. The Seafood Festival well, which, based on its name, is only used for the Seafood Festival. The RW4, referred to as Pavilion, and it's worth pointing out, that is the location of the well, right on that bend in the road. However, that well serves what we refer to as the beach pavilion at Little Ninny Pond. So the well is located there. However, there's a pipe that leads all the way to the northeast, to the beach pavilion. And that is where the septic system for that system is. So this is an example of where PFAS contaminated groundwater is being extracted at a well at one location. It is being transferred via pipe hundreds of feet away, utilized in the building, and then discharged to the septic system. The next well is Frosty Brew, which is located there. Thank you. And then the last of the town wells is the senior center well, RW2, which is, come back straight up there. Thank you. Which is the year-round well. The blue dots on this image represent monitoring wells that were installed as part of the initial SI effort. That does not represent the monitoring well networks that currently is in place. I'll get to that in a later video. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a very busy thing. We wanted to show this because the yellow polygon lines represent adjacent properties to all of what we refer to as CNOW. We've evaluated where the individual parcels are for the purpose of, and the blue lines again represent groundwater contours based on the well network and the data that we had available at the time. So we are evaluating for the purpose of primarily PFAS, which parcels are of higher concern or potential concern to us to target for residential well sampling, in addition to the town well sampling, which has been ongoing. And it is this combined set of data, groundwater gradients, the locations of where these, at least at the time, the known PFAS potential source areas were relative to where people's drinking water wells may exist. And that led us to the pink properties and rectangles, which are showing you 15 properties which were selected for residential well sampling. We have conducted 6 rounds of sampling from those residential properties over the last year and a half to 2 years, essentially trying to target what we call quarterly sampling to look at seasonal variation, changes over time. We don't want to just take one sample and make a decision based on one data point.
Can I just ask a question about the process for that? So do you personally reach out to the property owners and say, this is what we're looking for, we'd like to sample your well, and then it's purely voluntary? Like,
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
do you find that most people are receptive to testing the water?
So me personally, I have done some of that outreach. Carol has done much of it and is the consistent, or has been up until, it'll be a tag team effort. Greg and I will continue going forward. I would say yes. Most people that we have communicated with have been receptive. Those that were not immediately receptive had good questions, and it took a little more dialogue. Often, some of the, I wouldn't even call it resistance, people were all busy. If you were to receive an email or a call from me, I mean, you may not, but if somebody got an unexpected call from some geologist at the Army Corps of Engineers saying, hi, I'm interested,
Click.
if we get a response, often people, I've been told, people think it's a scam. They think that they're being sold some water treatment system by some contractor. So we get a range of opinions. Some people are resistant, and those people who resist were open to dialogue. If they seriously do not want us to do it, then that's their decision. But we want the public to make an educated decision. If we felt that it was critical and I wasn't having success, I would definitely delegate, say, Greg, take a swing. You know, it didn't go well for me. They didn't like me. I got them on a bad day. If it didn't go well with Greg and we still felt this is critical, we would be talking with, Nick and Patty and saying, look, maybe you guys, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is calling, and that's scary, especially if you get one of our right of entry letters, which looks very scary. Maybe these folks will be more successful. So we're willing to work to try, especially if we believe there's a critical need.
Thank you.
And, what else? If anything. The red polygon, you might see, I just drew that last night. That shows that is different than the yellow triangle you saw previously on an earlier figure. The reason for that So the landfills, some degree, they give us easy targets, right? We know there was a dump there. We know we need to evaluate that space. With PFAS, we are backtracking our way to probably where multiple releases occurred. We don't have a report that says we dumped all the PFAS here or we sprayed it all over there. We have been doing research in an effort to try and find that kind of documentation, but so far have not been successful. So we are using monitoring well and your supply well data to try and backtrack, upgrade to where the releases may have occurred, and other kind of commonsensical approaches. One place where we are concerned that PFAS may have been released would be the fire station, right? If this is AFFF foam, the fire department needed to have ready to use. The fire station is a place where they may have whoopsied a little bit of it on the ground. Or there could have been just a leaky valve and it was dripping on the ground. Or they may have flushed the hoses after a training event. So, yes, please. The former main fire station was located approximately there, which is hard to see at this scale, but for your folks familiar, would be in what was previously a heavily vegetated section between the walking path and due north of the basketball courts. So we cleared that area so that we could collect soil and some groundwater data because of monitoring wells that we had installed immediately down gradient of it, which had that relationship that I described earlier. It's a monitoring well referred to as MW10 or WISWA-MW10. And that was the first location we had found within that red polygon where that higher and lower concentrations of PFAS reversed. And we found the highest concentrations were significantly higher and they were in the shallow well. And that well was intentionally put there to be close to and down gradient of the fire station area. So based on that, we cleared the vegetation and we collected additional soil samples, which are still being evaluated.
Ron, were you referring to the response for the
So, okay, yeah. So that represents every one of those yellow parcels and other, we've only highlighted the yellow parcels in immediate proximity to the park footprint. There are other buildings, obviously, to the north of Route 1. That, and each of those parcels, as we were discussing, has a well and has a septic system. That big maroon shape, within the center of that, there is what's considered a public supply well. And it serves a small community, which would be the large building in the center of that dot, and then that small section of road, there's a number of homes right there. Yeah. So that circular pattern represents a wellhead protection zone because it is a public supply well. So a set distance from the well itself was determined through either an assumption or calculations. And then that radius circle was drawn around it. And that is to serve as a wellhead protection zone for potential impact to a community level supply well.
Is that 200-foot radius or 400?
Oh, no, much bigger. Yeah, that scale is probably, pretty, I don't know. My eyes are letting me go. Yeah. And it would depend. It would depend on the well's productivity. So based on pumping tests, they would know what the yield of the well is, and the wells form what's known as a cone of depression. And based on that, they will then build in a conservative factor to try and develop a wellhead protection area. Next slide. Examples of the on-site drinking water treatment system. So what we were referring to is point of use or point of entry treatment systems, POETs. Based on the initial sampling that was done of the town supply wells, we found that the Seafood Festival well and the Beach Pavilion well both exceeded 70 parts per trillion. That value that Greg had mentioned that EPA had set a health advisory value. And that is the value that DOD continues to utilize until EPA develops a federal MCL that's applicable nationwide. Because currently, every state is doing their own set of PFAS criteria. Some of those standards are promulgated, some are not promulgated, and DOD doesn't allow us to just, hopefully we are to avoid doing things hodgepodge fashion. They want consistency nationwide or worldwide. So 70 PPT is what we are allowed to take action on. So these are just example photos showing you the Seafood Festival well was constructed, the treatment system for it was constructed in a small shed that was placed directly adjacent to the well. The well is out of the image because it's below ground, right behind the left side of that shed. This well is only used for the Seafood Festival. It does not have regular power. So to activate this well to get water out of it, you have to bring a generator, connect the generator up to power the pump to then begin pumping the water. The door is open so you can see one of the vessels, that large, oval shaped feature is one of multiple components in the treatment train. You can see a little more, there's a pair of them. There's a primary vessel and a secondary vessel. The silver object on the wall in the upper right image is UV light for treatment, just of potential bacteria. And it's important to note that these treatment systems we have put in place to treat for PFAS. We are analyzing these wells for a very wide array of analytes. But PFAS is currently what's being treated because of its exceedance of that standard. We are attaching these treatment components to the town's infrastructure. So this, can be a challenge. We recently had to address some comments from Rhode Island DOH, and most of their questions to us tended to fall towards, you didn't give us a drawing that showed us the size of the plumbing or the length of the plumbing to the toilets. It's like, yeah, I don't have that drawing. That's the town's infrastructure. If you've got questions about the town's infrastructure, reach out to the town. So, but that's a coordination effort. But this infrastructure is the core, the government's infrastructure for this focused treatment. The initial TCRA, time critical removal action, involved 3 different systems. These 2 and 1 residential well, which had an exceedance of the federal drinking water standard, but not for PFAS. It did not exceed 70 at that time. It exceeded for a solvent, benzene. That showed up on an earlier slide. There was the acronym VOCs for volatile organic compounds with benzene specified. That was referencing the 1 residential property that we have a different type of treatment there. Looks very much like this, but the contents inside those cylinders is just a different material for treatment. Next slide, please. So, upcoming and planned work for 2024-25. That's Greg.
Welcome back, Greg.
Greg Henser, Army Corps of Engineers. So as Tracy mentioned, there was underground electrical vault, and we recently awarded a contract for a vendor to do that removal. We expect that vault will be excavated, removed, and disposed of off-site, and the trench backfilled probably late spring, early summer of this year. As Tracy mentioned, we are continuing to maintain the 3 groundwater drinking water treatment systems, or POET systems, and we plan to install 3 additional ones later this year. One's actually at the Frosty Drew Observatory building. So that's upcoming. We're going to continue to do our remedial investigation work. And as part of that, we also will continue to do residential drinking water sampling and testing. Not just residential, but we also do some municipal buildings. For example, the police station, we test their water. And then, just to give you kind of like approximate time frame, remedial investigations can, by nature, be stepwise, where we go collect data, we refine the conceptual site model, we collect more data. 5 years to do an RI, is an approximation. At a site this size, it could be longer. So on the screen, we started it last year. potentially in 2027. And then beyond that, like the CERCLA process I showed earlier, there'd be a feasibility study, remedial design, that could extend beyond 2027, just to kind of give you like a sense of time that we'd be out there in the future. And then we are sensitive to events, other restrictions, both for the town and at the wildlife refuge. We're tracking town festivals during the summer, other special events, and we'll work with you to make sure that our operations don't interfere with that. On the fish and wildlife side, they're sensitive to noise for disturbing waterfowl. And also there's hunting out there for the safety of our workers. We don't typically like to work when there's hunting in season. So that's some of the kind of scheduling challenges or restrictions that we work around. Next slide, please. And then just so for your planning, we're collecting a lot of information and gathering a lot of information from Ninigret Park. And we're here to provide that information to you to help inform you in making development decisions. And I just want to, stress that if the town or town contractors were to do, work on the Ninigret Park just to do the extra care, due diligence, keep us informed so that we can coordinate with you, share knowledge, and if there were any disturbance of subsurface soil during any sort of development activities out there, we would encourage that, particularly if it's in one of the landfills, that work can be involved oversight by a munitions specialist who could take proper action. And then also, if there was soils to be removed from areas that we're still investigating, that soil be properly characterized appropriately so that it can be handled and managed appropriately. And also, this is part of this CERCLA, and so we're doing our part to investigate and then, if needed, remediate this site. But if the town were to have activities for, as I guess for sake of example, if there were going to be a firefighting foam demonstration out there that could introduce PFAS, there could be, that would introduce another source that could complicate our investigation. Or maybe a realistic example would be if there was material excavated from a landfill that was used for fill on another part of the site, or materials imported from off-site, on-site. It just makes our job challenging. And as part of CERCLA, if there's multiple parties that are responsible, it could result in having shared costs for the remedial investigation and the remedy. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. And again, we're here to coordinate with you, and we want to work with you on your Ninigret Park property. And then also, Tracy was saying there was the water supply area that we know that there is PFAS in groundwater, and we're taking action. There's currently 3 of the wells out there that we have POET systems on, or will be. The third one will be online hopefully later this year. If the town were for some reason going to install more wells out there, it's not guaranteed that the DoD would, under FUDs, would do the treatment of that well due to the kind of already historical knowledge that the groundwater has PFAS issues. So, again, just making you aware of that. Next slide, please. And then also, and I think, which kind of maybe spurred this meeting here this evening, is the environmental land use restriction of a former tank farm area. This tank farm was remediated in 2012. The remedy consisted of excavation of soil that was, of no surprise, contaminated with petroleum beneath the tank farm. They excavated down to, I think, 10 to 16 feet, but there was soil left in place below the groundwater. Because that remained in place, and per the remedy, there would be environmental land use restriction, which essentially, if there were going to be work performed within the tank farm, that work would be performed in accordance with the soil management plan, so that the construction workers would know how to properly handle that soil. It's also, as part of the remedy, is a requirement from the state, and I can talk to that, but next to me is actually the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, so maybe Nick wants to come up and just talk about the ELUR real quick. Sure.
Welcome, Mr. Nunes.
Yeah, Nick Nunes with the Rhode Island DM. I guess before I say anything, do you guys have any specific questions about this ELUR before I just kind of dive into what they are and kind of why we require them?
So when you were here in 2021,
Yes.
one of the things that you had mentioned was the DEM has kind of like a standard ELUR form along with the required checklist that if the town were to sign, then we would be required to follow along with that and do the, I think it was annual reporting, or was it once a year or every 3 years?
Annual, yeah.
Annually.
Yeah.
So I do have some questions on that document
Sure.
itself. Did you want to go there now, or do you want to do?
Well, I guess I'll just give a brief overview
Okay.
of why they're required, and it kind of goes to some of the planning and awareness issues that Greg just brought up with, ensuring that there's that communication. If the town's going to go out there, maybe you have a plan for a new structure. I mean, we're talking about a very specific area right here, but just move in the future. I mean, just looking ahead, with some of these other investigations that are going on out here, there'll likely be an additional land use restriction required for the other part of the property as well. Just because we know there's groundwater contamination out there, we may find some soil contamination that also warrants this as well, but that's a long ways away. But right now we have this area of the project. This was cleaned up, remediated, and it's actually on, this figure doesn't show it, but it's actually on a separate parcel because the town-owned portion of Ninigret is two separate parcels, and this is on that little kind of finger to the right that kind of goes up. And not most of these Project 9 sites that we've talked about tonight, like the landfills, the water supply area, it's actually on a different parcel. So these restrictions get
You know
recorded.
what parcel that is?
I know it's either like 45.1 or 45.2, I think, are the lots.
Is that what we call it?
The Park 50.
Is that what we call the town 55?
Yeah.
Is it the town 55 or is it part of the 172? Because I know when we discussed this in 2021, there was an issue about, because this was so close to the boundary between
Yeah.
the town on 55 and the 172, we had discussion about bringing in Diane Keith from the Federal Lands to Parks program. So is this on the town on 55 or is it partially on the 172?
I'm not sure which parcels those are. I'm just going off, like, I don't know if we could go back to a figure that had the tax parcels up a couple slides back. I don't know if we could move backwards. Yeah. Yep, keep going. Yeah, so you can kind of see here, if you look at those yellow boundaries, so there's that little shape, almost like rectangular shape, to the north of the kind of triangle that makes up the park. Yeah. Yep, so that's at the bottom edge of that. That's where the little tank farm area we're talking about. So how does
And-
that relate to what you were saying?
That's on the 55, but the circle that's drawn around
The
that,
extension,
does
yeah.
that extend onto the 172, or is that completely in the town-owned 55? Like,
Yeah.
is it completely within your yellow drawing there?
That's something we'd have to look at, but realistically, I mean, and that's something we could discuss. We'd want to record it for that parcel for certain, because that's where the bulk of it's on. And like I said, in the future, the rest of that parcel, the rest of the town-owned site is likely going to require something similar. So it may be something that, if it's just an issue of like the boundary and there's not actually any of that contamination that's extending over that, it's kind of that buffer zone that we were talking about. There may be some leeway there, but yeah. So I don't have a definitive answer for that right now, but it's something we could discuss. But realistically, the bulk of the residual contamination we're talking about is on that 55. Yep. But yeah, so as part of any remediation that happens throughout the state, and the DEM, we have just over 2,000 properties where there's been some sort of hazardous materials that have been detected. And as part of the cleanup, it's not always feasible or even economical to remove all of the contamination. So sometimes we leave it behind because we've installed like an engineered cap that prevent people who are using the property from being exposed to that contamination. Sometimes there's residual groundwater contamination, so we want to ensure that folks don't put in a well and withdraw that water. But basically, about a third of the sites that we've had, just as an example, and that's not just these DoD sites, but all sorts of sites, end up with something like this. Either we call it an environmental land use restriction, CERCLA calls it a land use control, and other states have their own names for them. But it's basically a deed restriction that brings with it some restrictions on use potentially, but also builds in some notification requirements to ensure that there is proper communication in the future, and that any future landowners or holders of interest in the property are aware of the contamination that's there, so that in the future, for this site, for instance, if someone from the town, maybe it's a new town council, maybe it's a new director of planning, decides, hey, I want to put a building out there, goes ahead, funds it, digs up the foundation out there, hits oil, what do we do? Hit some contaminated soil, and then worst case scenario, sometimes we see that contaminated soil. Maybe we don't know it's contaminated because it's not something obvious or egregious like petroleum, and now it gets shipped to somewhere else, and now you've had contamination moved off site, and you're potentially responsible for it. So it's trying to basically memorialize what the issues are here and ensure that there's some protections in place moving forward for any future development activities. So for this site, the environmental land use restriction would, basically require notification if there's going to be any soil disturbance in this specific area. It also will likely, restrict potable water use, so you don't put a well out there, which probably isn't likely anyway with the PFAS issues now. But it just we'll keep those things in place, and hopefully, because it's attached, it's recorded against the property, it's attached to the deed. Folks will be more aware of it. It's not a perfect solution, I won't say it is, but it definitely is another layer of protection to kind of ensure that some of those unfortunate consequences of things getting lost in translation or forgotten, and that's where that monitoring requirement comes in as well. No one goes out there and makes a mistake that could be costly in the end.
Do we currently have an ELUR with you folks?
You specifically, the town, or
Town.
That's actually a good question. Likely, it's certainly likely, especially for like the I'm not sure if the town landfill has one, but there's plenty of examples of municipalities with ELURs on parks and things like that. It's not something unique.
Well, my question is, if we don't, why now?
Well,
The site's been closed for 40 years. Why now?
why do it? Well, because now we've gone through the remediation process. We know that there's residual contamination left behind, and now,
You've known that for a long time.
yes, but we can't report it. The town has to.
I'm just saying, but you've known this, been there for a long time.
Yes.
So it was actually a component of the remedial action work plan that the Corps put together, provided to all the stakeholders. The RIDEM reviewed that, and the town reviewed it, and had no comment, accepted it. So that's part of the Corps' work plan to execute.
So we
Back
have
in
one,
2008.
we have one now then?
No, the Corps cannot put it in place because we don't own the property.
No, I understand that, but you didn't have so you're asking the town to do it now, but haven't in the
We've
past.
been asking you to do it since 2000.
Okay. Well, for me, I can speak. I've only
Right,
been here,
right.
I've only been here a year.
You're right,
So-
I'm not, this isn't a
So
blame
I'm,
game.
so I'm,
It's-
so I'm curious.
Since 2012, we've
Okay.
been asking the town to put it in place. We've
Gotcha.
drafted the soil management plan, we've drafted the checklist, we drafted that 200-foot boundary around, which is something that can be adjusted or discussed. But it's been,
And again, if you come to the microphone, because then they can't hear you.
so we drafted the ELUR and handed that to the town. We've done as much as we can do, not owning the property. We can't put the ELUR in place. But we've also notified the town that whether you put the ELUR in place or don't, we have notified you of these issues. The burden and the responsibility is yours. And what the purpose of it, I'll let you.
So this is the third town council that we have briefed since 2012 to try and get this ELUR implemented. The previous town administrator, Mark Stankiewicz, my understanding is the reluctance for the town to implement this is because the town feels that once they implement it, and then if they don't comply with doing the annual inspections, that they're going to get a nasty gram or beat up by RIDEM. Nick has told Mark Stankiewicz and other councils in the past that We're just going to send you a letter reminding you that you have to basically complete this requirement. Also, I think it was Susan, recently, I asked her, I said, what's the reluctance of the town for putting this in place? And she said, well, they seem to think that if they put it in place, then the town assumes the liability for this particular site as opposed to the liability remaining with the Corps. The Corps is no longer liable for this site. The Corps is done. Project 08 is closed out. There's nothing left for the Corps to do. The town is liable financially and or legally, regardless of whether you implement the ELUR or not. So if it's just the fact that it's another administrative burden on the town, that we have to get somebody to fill out this checklist, walk the site, make sure that there are no changes to it, or if there are changes, we're not saying you can't develop this particular piece of property. We're just telling you that if you do, you have to do your due diligence. You want to put a building there? Put a building there. But make sure you put a vapor barrier underneath that building and you're in total compliance to make sure that you're either not moving contamination, spreading contamination somewhere else on-site or off-site, and protecting whoever's going to be occupying that building from getting exposed to potential contaminants. That's all we're telling you. It's to protect the town. It's in the town's best interest to implement the ELUR.
Counselor Sarah?
But you just said the Corps is done, right?
The Corps is done with Project 08, that particular site.
So are there more projects there?
Not on that particular site.
Not at the tanks.
With the caveat that the monitoring wells that were installed as part of that effort, we have intentionally left in place in case they were needed in the future because we knew the 09 project was coming. That
I
is
mean,
now.
there's more projects is what I mean.
So the 09 project for the
So you're only
groundwater.
talking about one number is done. She's not explaining that.
We're talking Site 8, the prior petroleum
You didn't
tank
explain-
farm.
you didn't
Okay, one at a time, because the
It's
microphone
done.
picks up one at a time.
And so what Tracy's trying to say is we installed wells as part of the Project
I
08
understand.
project. We are going to potentially use those wells and sample those wells because right now we're trying to delineate PFAS across the entire Ninigret Park site. We have wells there that we've used to sample for petroleum. Now we may utilize them as part of our larger investigation to see is there any PFAS in that area. But as far as the tank farm is concerned, it's been fully remediated and it is closed out.
Okay, you came to the mic. You said the Corps is done.
The Corps is done with...
Whoa.
Go ahead.
I'm not done.
Okay.
Okay. You did not say the Corps is done with Site 8.
I believe
You were not specific. Again, I've only been
Okay.
here a year.
we're done with Site 8, and that's what I intended to say, and I thought that's what I did say. We are done with Site 8, unless something,
Well, that makes
unless,
sense
Again,
now.
just one at a time.
right, Site 8 Petroleum Tank Farm has been fully remediated and closed out.
Okay, Counselor Cooper, then I've got some.
Sure. So, yeah, I think, Rippy, you bring up a point, which is I think there's also been some confusion. Maybe it's only on my part, but I think it's been more broadly that the ELUR was going to somehow affect ongoing projects, et cetera. And I think the materials that I saw to prepare for today, and because as an aside, I would like to say, could we make your slides, we don't have a copy of those, if we could have a copy of that to make them a part of the record of this meeting, I think that would really be valuable. And in some way to get them so that we can see the color coding, et cetera, because that's important. So at any rate, I think that part of what has been a concern is sort of confusing the ongoing work and the breadth of all of the things that, of course, you've discussed here, which when people look at it, initially they kind of say, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to do anything, you know? And so as I understand it, this focus for this ELUR is on this particular tank site. It is a site that's largely in the 55 acres, so I think that's really a concern for the town, that we make sure that that's safe and treated properly. And then the other piece that I think sometimes has gotten lost is that people have thought there's a very low likelihood of danger for the town because you've done all this cleanup. But the real danger is a liability for us if we do the work without keeping in mind these restrictions. And then very easily, I can conceive of a situation where we would dig and the dirt would get taken up and taken someplace else. And that's where you really, then all of a sudden, the town is on the hook, which we haven't been up to this point. So I guess I have a couple questions. One is that it seemed that in some of the earlier materials that were presented, the area was 100 feet, and now it seems like we're talking about 200 feet. So I don't know. I can show you what I have from the 2021 meeting, but I don't,
Right. I believe there was one area indicated for a soil under the soil management plan, and then the larger radius was for groundwater restriction
Okay.
siting. Yeah.
Okay, so really what we're talking about now, despite all of the other great things that you've, relayed to us tonight, really the focus is on a 200-foot area circumference around where those tanks are now and they are largely on the 55. And then the other kinds of restrictions that you're talking about, which is like to know that we have a policy or we have an awareness in planning or building, et cetera, that vapor barrier is needed in that area, that once you start to dig from 10 feet down to 16 or whatever, you're in the danger zone. And then the other question I had was, I thought from the previous materials that there was reference to a 5-year inspection, but now it sounds like you're saying it's an annual inspection.
Yeah, so I'm assuming the 5-year inspection was talking probably like the circle of 5-year review. There's a 5-year review process that has to be undergone for many remedies. So that's probably where that 5-year would have came from, not for this particular site, but it might have been from talking about some of these other projects moving forward in the future. Post remedy, there's a potential for a 5-year review.
What was in this packet that we had from the 2021 meeting is called DEM, Environmental Land Use, ELUR, 5-year compliance self-evaluation form.
Yeah, so those self-evaluation forms, it is 1 year, so it's not the 5 years, but it's literally just a checklist. I mean, it's something anyone who works at the park could fill out. It's no requirement, anyone else has to fill it out, but it's just a matter of saying, yes, we didn't disturb the soils here. There's no new wells here, and you can email it to us, and that's it. And if they're not submitted, that's where it comes in, you guys are going to be on the hook and pay fines or anything. That's not the case. We just send you a letter basically saying, you didn't submit your annual monitoring, and we might not even send it if you miss it 1 year. We might not even catch it. But eventually we'll say, hey, we need an update on where things are at. And it's just that form that has to be filled out.
And this form, as I look at it, it doesn't require us to use an outside contractor to do testing or anything. It's mostly a visual inspection.
Oh, completely visual. Yeah, there's no requirement for an environmental consultant or anyone else, or anyone that works in the Parks Department who, knows how to send an email can do it. So that's it.
So I'm going to jump in here.
Sure.
So one of the issues that came up in 2021, the draft document that we had in front of us that night, and which is the same as in our packet tonight, was the document that was prepared by the Army Corps of Engineers as an example for discussion.
Yep.
During that meeting, you had pointed out to us that that was not what the DEM required, and that the documents that the DEM required were available on the DEM website. So earlier today, in preparation for this, I went and I pulled the documents, and specifically in there where it talks about the DEM Environmental Land Use Restriction Annual Compliance Evaluation Form. So that was part of the discrepancy between the 5 years and the 1 years. What was presented to us in 2021 and also in tonight's packet was the draft document to begin discussion, whereas the actual document from the DEM does require the annual inspection. However, when they talk about, I'm going to read specifically from here, the document from the DEM website specifically says, and the council has this because we forwarded it, it's under item H, where it says an officer or director of the company with direct knowledge of past and present conditions of the property. Actually, let me take a step back. H begins inspection and noncompliance. It shall be the obligation of the grantor or any future holder of any interest in the property to provide for annual inspections of the property for compliance with the ELUR in accordance with department requirements. It then goes on, an officer or director of the company with direct knowledge of past and present conditions of the property, the company's representative, and it says a qualified environmental professional will, on behalf of the grantor or future holder of any interest in the property, evaluate the compliance status of the property on an annual basis. Upon completion of the evaluation, the company or representative, environmental professional, will prepare and simultaneously submit to the department, to the grantor or future holder of any interest in the property, an evaluation report detailing the findings of the inspection and noting any compliance violations. If the property is determined to be out of compliance with the terms of the ELUR, the grantor or future holder of any interest in the property shall submit a corrective action plan in writing to the DEM, to the department, within 10 days of receipt of the evaluation report, indicating the plans to bring the property into compliance with the ELUR, including at a minimum a schedule for implementation of the plan. In the event of any violation of the terms of this restriction, which remains uncured more than 90 days after written notice of violation, all department approvals and agreements relating to the property may be voided at the sole discretion of the department. So to me, this reads as a little more than just somebody going out there and taking pictures and then submitting their report, because it specifically says a qualified
Yes.
environmental professional.
Yeah, so I can clarify that. So that draft, that's actually an and/or statement that we include in there, and it's site dependent. So there are sites where we would not allow what you read there was a company representative or owner or company rep with knowledge of the property, which is, for you guys, you're not a company, it's a town. Someone in the town with knowledge of the property, basically. There are instances where it's not as simple as just a do not dig issue or do not put a well in, but we might have active treatment systems involved that need to be monitored, like subslab depressurization systems that are pulling vapors from beneath the house to ensure they don't get into the house and affect occupants. So in those cases, we would not allow just anyone to do these inspections, because there may need to be things that need to be monitored and checked, and so we would require a qualified environmental professional. For the town, for this case, that won't even be on there, because there's no need for someone with that level of expertise to do this level of survey. So that typically is an and/or. I'm not sure if the one that you have is in draft form. I'm going to take a look.
I just pulled the blank form right off your website.
Yeah, so anything that's in black and brackets.
Thank you.
Anything on that form that's in brackets and bolded, that's editable, and that's editable for what we basically cater to the individual site. So here, that qualified environmental professional portion would not be included. Like I said, there's very few instances where it would.
I've got a follow-up. So, train of thought. Go ahead.
Well, just so you know, on this form here, the environmental professional is not black and circled as things next to it. So,
Yes, I'm telling you, it would not be on that form. If we had a
what
restriction.
you just said is that anything in black that has these parentheses or whatever you call them would not be included on our form. And those are not on those words.
Under section
Not
8.
on-
Yeah,
Or qualified.
no, but it's not bolded. It says A.
So what I'm saying is the company rep one would be an option here, and it is an or statement, correct? It's not.
Well, that's bolded in the parentheses.
Yeah. So we would not, there's instances, like I said, where we wouldn't allow a company rep or an owner to do their own annual inspection. That's not the case for this site. That's for very complex sites that would have remedies that require some sort of engineering evaluation or technical kind of hand involved in doing the inspection, more than just what we'd say, more than just a windshield survey or someone going out and, just making sure that there's not a new building there that wasn't there last year kind of issue.
So just for everyone's information, because we talked about this in 2021, and for the benefit of those that weren't here, this is the location of the park where the disc golf is located. It's holes 7 and 8 in that general vicinity there. So just for everyone, so we're not planning on building any buildings there, because we've seen what happens during meetings, and all of a sudden, the town's building on a contaminated area, there's vapors, and, people are getting injured. So there's no plans to do anything with the existing disc golf. That's for all intents and purposes, going to remain a disc golf. There's no plans to put a building, there's no plans to put a well. There are plans, however, though, to like redo the course, in essence of they're planning on replacing the pads. So where you throw the disc from, they're planning on replacing those. They might be replacing baskets and stuff like that. So if they were to dig deeper than 10 feet to put in a basket, then that would not be allowed, correct?
It's not that it wouldn't be allowed, like nothing is effectively prohibited here, but if you're going to do any sort of excavation work out there, you typically want to notify us in advance. And then we determine if there's any sort of like certain requirements that would need to be done. But if you came to us and said, hey, look, we're going to go out here and replace these pads and these baskets, it's no more than a 3-foot deep foundation. All right, that's not in the area we know that's contaminated. Just go ahead and just, you know, in your annual inspection report this year, just note that these pads were replaced, no excavations exceeded 3 feet below grade, and that would be it.
So typically, like unofficially, what the town does at Ninigret Park, it's like no digging more than a foot.
Sure.
It's kind of like
Yeah.
the unwritten rule, and, you know, maybe Carl has something, you know, to add to this, but that's pretty much what everybody knows, you know, you just don't go down more than a foot. So, well, I understand everything with the ELUR and how we're trying to, you know, make sure people stay safe. Just so you know, that's kind of our unwritten rule in town, that you're not allowed to do this, to kind of prevent from happening what you're talking about, where it's, you know, contaminated soil is being moved from one part of the park to the other. So just sharing information, you know, what typically happens down
No,
there.
and that's all well and good, but it's just, there are plenty of instances where, you know, folks thought they had things that, you know, they thought, oh, everything's fine, but 5 years from now, someone gets a great idea, no one thinks that it's going to be an issue, they go out, they maybe put a building out there, maybe they just wanted to put a little like rest center or you know, something or anything, and then you run into problems later because there's, you know, potential for vapor intrusion that wasn't addressed, or someone wanted to just put an irrigation well and thought that would be a great spot because there's already a bunch of wells there. There must be water there. So there's like plenty of examples where that's happened, and that's what we're just trying to prevent. And it's, like I said, in the long run, protecting you and hopefully from some folks in the future making that mistake because they might not have that awareness of the issues that are going on out here.
So when the multi-purpose trail was put in, were you guys out there during that, you know, where the digging was occurring and any excavating or anything?
When was that put in?
2015?
No, and I mean, we probably weren't even aware of that at the time because there wasn't, this restriction was in place and you were doing work in there. We would have been notified is the idea, and we weren't, obviously, with that case.
Interesting. Okay, Councilor Stokes, did you have something?
I have a few questions.
Go ahead.
We'll start. If we didn't have an ELUR and we came and asked the DEM, hey, we know this is a sensitive spot, we'd like to do this, would the DEM advise us?
Yeah, of course.
Would you provide education and advisement to the town in those cases?
Yeah, of course we would if that was the case. We're not going to not do anything because it's not an ELUR.
The ELUR in this case, is it site-specific or is it parcel-specific?
In this specific case, it's site-specific within that parcel, so it wouldn't apply to the entire parcel.
So the deed restriction would only be specified to that one area?
Yeah, so if you look on that boilerplate that you guys have, the example ELUR, the language is property or contaminated site. In this case, it'd be contaminated site because it's only a small defined area within the parcel itself, but the entire property you wouldn't have to notify us if you were digging up by the road or anything like that.
The last question I would have with the ELUR part about that is, say the ELUR is in place, beyond language there, 10 years down the road, the town goes a different direction, they disagree completely and they want to do X, Y, Z. What authority does the state have over the ELUR that they don't have today?
Yeah, and that's a good question, and that kind of goes back to the point that Carol was making earlier about like liability. So the contamination that's left behind there now, the Army Corps has done their remediation. From the FUDS program, their hands are tied. They can't do any additional work out here. So any of that contaminated soil now, the responsibility if that ever gets like moved somewhere or you know, shipped off site inappropriately, it's going to fall on the property owner, in this case the town. So whether or not the ELUR is in place, it's not going to affect Like, we don't have more authority because the ELUR is in place. You move contaminated soil, you're a responsible party, you're liable. I mean, if you went ahead and built something out there that went against what the remedial action required, like putting in a vapor barrier, if you're going to build a new structure out there, the town's still liable. And it's not like this ELUR gives us some sort of extra leverage or anything like that. That's not the point. It's really just to memorialize the conditions out there and then try to ensure that those mistakes don't occur moving forward.
Right. Well, like I said, the reason I ask is, I mean, unlike a typical, I would say, like, let's just say a resident homeowner where you maybe have a site and then they buy and sell the property, lose these things in translation. A municipality, I mean, keep pretty stringent records of things. We have a lot of record keeping. We have a lot of data points that we protect and stuff. And I guess what I'm grappling with and wondering is that the town's liability is the same for whether, if we disturb that soil now or not. Army Corps has said they've remediated the site in the Tanks Farm specific area, the petroleum farm. They've remediated the site. We're responsible for whatever we do, no matter what the case is. We know that. It's on the record. This is part of it. So I guess why would we then add a level of complexity when we can ask for your advisory to help us in the future? We already know that we don't want to be digging over there. It seems like it may. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, let me say something first, Carol. I mean, I don't want to rehash the reasons why we do these environmental land use restrictions. Frankly, they're required by, our state law and state regulations. So, I mean, we're here trying to, talk to you guys about, the reason why it's required. But at the end of the day, it is required. We're trying to help you guys understand the merits, but it's not something we can kind of talk around at the end of the day. I hate to say it, but I mean, these are requirements when there's contamination left behind on a site that's been remediated. It's not unique to you guys. Like I said, there's over 600 of these on sites throughout the state. And frankly, they're on sites that are, a lot less contaminated than this. So, I mean, this is just, like I said, part of the process. It's meant to safeguard from issues happening moving forward with folks who are using the property from being exposed to contamination that's left behind as part of this process.
Yes, I just wanted to add to your comment about the fact we're aware of this. It's on the record. It's not on the record until it's implemented. And so, again, I've said this is the third council that we brief. You have turnover, just like anybody else has turnover. When you're gone, someone takes your place. That someone that takes your place is unaware of what's been happening since 2012 or even 2008 when we remediated the site. You have one council member that says he's been here for a short period of time and he's not aware of these things. So that's what this ELUR, put it in place, will guarantee that regardless of who's sitting in these chairs for a future council, will be aware of, or at least have a mechanism by which they can become aware of it, as opposed to us always coming down here and trying to brief you guys and bring you up to speed on it. So I beg to differ. It's not on the record.
Well, then I guess my last question would be, if it's required, and why did the councils in 2008, 2012, all the way up to now, not do it? If it's required. It's required, but the town is the only one that can implement it. I can't force you to implement it. Rydam can't force you to implement it. But just because you don't implement it and don't make it a part of your permanent record to make sure that subsequent councils are aware of this, to be protective of the town so that it doesn't prevent you from developing or doing anything you want with the site. It prevents you from doing something that is going to cost you a lot more money if you don't follow proper procedures, knowing what contamination is on the site. So it's a protective measure for the town. It's not a protective measure for anybody else. But they had the same trepidation. Your predecessors had the same trepidation, the same questions, the same delay, the same that you have. And that's why we're here today.
So Councilor Sarah's got a question.
Just so you know, I own a small business. And anytime the government says I'm here to help you, that's never true. So that's my experience, just so you know.
So I'm gonna pivot from that. One of the comments that were made was that we're legally responsible, one way or the other. And that's one of my concerns. Like, if we put this restriction on, then legally, what does that do to us? We've heard this is what protects us. So I'm asking our solicitor, do you concur with that statement, or do you see any other concerns?
Well, no, I don't concur with the statements. And first of all, I know of no legal obligation for you to record this. Now, I understand the terms that are being moved around, and you have to be careful with those kind of words. Required is not a legal obligation. And I am not aware, no one's ever shown me any statutory or regulatory authority that requires these to be put on when you're an innocent purchaser, even though you're the property owner. Secondly, whether you have it or not, your liability is going to be the same. Your liability is not, you're not being protected if you record this, and you're not being immunized by recording it. Your liability doesn't change. They're only saying to institutionalize the knowledge of this by recording a declaration. I even, frankly, take issue. This is not a restriction. It's not a deed restriction. It's literally a declaration because there's no grantee. Nobody's taking anything. When you put a restriction, I have to give it from the owner to someone else, some other entity, a person. There has to be an interest in the property transferred to someone else. There's no interest being granted. This document that says, we acknowledge that this, whatever the conditions are here on this site. I wouldn't refer to it as a deed.
So I guess my question then for the DEM is, what statute, like what section of Rhode Island general law?
Yeah, so I can actually share with the town council the exact stipulation in the regulations where it is required for land use controls. So I can probably send that to you separately with the actual citation. I can have it come from our legal office if that's helpful.
That would be helpful.
Yeah. No, it is under the rules and regulations for the management of hazardous materials. So it's under what we call the remediation regulations. And those are, so this cleanup was done under the CERCLA process, which is the federal process. But they rely on our state regulations as the applicable and relevant and appropriate requirements. So they default to us for certain things once there's been an established risk and once the cleanup's been done. And so this ELUR is something that's required under our regulations. So basically, I'll refer you to that directly. I don't disagree with the second part of what you said, that the liability is not going to change, but it is the institutionalizing of the knowledge is essentially what the point of this is to ensure that doesn't happen. There's no, lapse in that if possible. It's not a perfect tool. I agree. It's not a perfect tool, but it is required under our regulations.
If you could send us that, 'cause
Yeah.
if we're required to do it by law, that's one thing.
Yeah.
If, we're requested to do it, that's something else. But that kind of leads to my second question, more towards the solicitor. Absent doing this, let's say it's not legally required, just lay out the argument. Absent doing this, is there a way the town can memorialize this, like for our own information?
Well, you could do a resolution, you could record notice on your own land evidence records regarding the property. There's a lot of ways to do this. All this is basically a notice, declaration. That's all this is. And, they implicitly are claiming that the reporting of this gives them the rights to enforce violations, but I don't think that they need this to enforce violations. They have a statutory right to do that anyway.
Okay. If you could get us that section of
Certainly.
the law, or have legal counsel send it to
Yeah.
our solicitor, I think that'd be helpful.
Certainly.
Yep. And then just one other thing for the point of the council, whatever we decide to do here, we also need to contact Diane Keith, who is our representative from the Federal Lands to Parks program, because she needs to be made aware of what's happening down there on the property. I emailed her earlier today just to see if she had any communication with anybody on this, and she hasn't in about 2.5 years. So I told her whatever we did, I would make sure that she was kept in the loop. Council Stokes?
This is more of a Peter/town question. This particular site, which is pretty well documented and specified, is it possible it might be hard, but is it possible for the town to parcel that separately, record it as a separate, basically create a deed for it and then put it's the town's own restriction for?
It's probably possible, but you gotta look at the detail.
Okay.
Because there's no road there, things like that. There are all these rules and regulations of subdivision, so it's theoretically possible.
And just so you know, one of the things we discussed in 2021 was perhaps surveying it and having the, the pins put there, but we decided that really wasn't, the path to take. So just sharing information from 2.5 years ago. Yes.
Bonnie Van Slyke. 2.5 years ago, I was on the council sitting there, and we did talk about this. And one of the issues is that we cannot do something somewhere else that makes the petroleum move. So in thinking of, say, stormwater management, in terms of the new park plan, where that stormwater management goes would be very important regarding this site. So if you had, if it was recorded and their engineer could look and see what this site was all about, they could cite the stormwater management better. So I just think, I don't know why we're jumping through hoops just to safeguard ourselves. I think, that's just my opinion, and was my opinion back then. Thank you.
And I would say we're doing it to safeguard ourselves. That's precisely why we're jumping.
I don't understand why there's a problem signing and, having an environmental land use restriction, because I do believe it will safeguard our.
Right. And I won't argue, but back in 2021, we had the same discussion and we still have no, signed document. So.
Back in 2021, you and Susan were going to get together with Peter and Nick Nunes and draft one and get it done. And that hasn't happened for various reasons. Yeah. So that was going to happen.
So there was no motion. Yes.
Yes, there
was. Not to sign the document.
Francis Topping, Stillwater. I just had a question. In that Ninigret Park plan where they talked about maybe removing asphalt and moving it somewhere else, that I don't know how deep that goes, but would that be something that would be a problem in the park?
So, yeah, so with regards to the Ninigret Park plan, it's a concept, it's a guideline. There's no plan to remove concrete at this time. There's no plan to build anything.
I know there's no plan at the moment,
right,
but it is in the proposed draft, if you like.
So
I'm just making a question. If that were to be done.
I'll answer your question. So that to remove the pavement was in the 2008 plan. It was in the 2014 plan that was never approved. So to answer your question, if it's in the plan, it doesn't mean it's going to get done. If the town were to actually go to remove pavement, then yes, absolutely, we should let the Army Corps of Engineers know what we're doing.
Yeah, I'm just saying that is something, the question was, is that something that would be an issue that they would need to know about? That's all I'm asking.
Right, and that we would do regardless of whether there was an ELUR or not. And I hate to say, but it's what should have been done in 2015 when that multi-purpose trail was done. But having an ELUR on this property would have had no impact on that whatsoever because that's not the same parcel. Councilor Stokes.
I just want to take the opportunity while the geologist and Army Corps is here. This plan hasn't come to us with this draft yet, so we don't know the Ninigret master plan they're talking about. But my curiosity question is, because especially with the pond, and you talked about the drainage, what would the ramifications of pavement removal do for would it be beneficial for the groundwater? Would it be negative? Let's take out the side of taking contaminated pavement and putting it somewhere. I'm just saying the general idea of massive pavement removal. Yeah, I know. That was a good one.
I've done it. I hate to give you this answer, but it depends.
Yeah. Well,
Right? It's not all the same. Like the contents of a landfill are not all the same. The condition of the asphalt is not all the same. One of those images that showed the larger polygon for the water supply well area. It extends up to a large area of pavement. We don't know where the foam was all released. The fire station appears to be an area where it did. The burn pit area is definitely a place where it did. The landfills probably are places where residual contamination was taken to. If an airplane crashed and they went out there and foamed it after the common dates of AFFF foam containing these compounds, 1969 forward, that area on one of these former runways or taxiways could be a residual hotspot for PFAS contamination. We will have to backtrack our way into that based on data collection. If it's very small and limited, we may never find it. We are concerned about asphalt or hard concrete, the hard paved surfaces. If we could bring up the presentation again, if you go back to probably the first slide, one of the very initial slides, it's World War II, black and white. So in World War II, whatever the firefighting methods were, they did not include PFAS-containing compounds.
Fish guts.
But
That's what they used. They used a fish foam.
protein-based foams were used before PFAS compounds, horse blood, cow blood, proteins. This image at least indicates, if you see the large rectangle to the north or top of the image, that's the main hangar building. All the dark things outside of that on essentially what is, I'll make it red, arm wave at it. Those are all airplanes. All those dark things around that big building, those are the aircraft. So this is World War II. Those are F-4U Corsairs with pilots in front of it. Each of those dark things represents an airplane. The airplanes were fueled from the fuel from the tank farm that was taken in a truck and was driven out to the flight line fueling area where they fueled the aircraft. So, jumping forward in time, when AFFF foam containing perfluorinated compounds was in firefighting equipment, if they were fueling an aircraft and they spilled fuel on the wing, they hoped it wouldn't burst into flames. As a preventative measure, they would come out and spray foam on it to try and save the life of the pilot and not lose an airplane. That may have happened on that paper. It may have happened many times in many places on that paper. If an airplane came in and the pilot had concerns, the landing gear indicator light says my gear isn't down, I'm declaring an emergency. The fire crew would deploy out and be ready to foam that aircraft when he landed if he had a problem. We don't have details about how many or how few or where precisely those events may have occurred. Again, we're backtracking into it based on 40 years later groundwater concentrations or soils data. So the potential exists that those hard surfaces, the asphalt and the concrete, may represent residual contamination. We don't know yet because we're in the RI process. We haven't completed the investigation, so I can't tell you. If you came to us today and said, we've got a plan to do some work, unfortunately, we may not be able to give you fully satisfying answers. But we at least want to have that conversation. If you come to us before and or right and say, we've got these plans, we would like to do something, whatever it is. If you at least communicate that, we then have the opportunity to elevate, well, we have a little bit more concern over here based on what we know. Ryan may know something we don't know. Having that conversation is really, and it was in one of the final slides, our recommendations. That's what we want to encourage, to try and help protect the town and the town's residents from unknowingly buying into risk. Because you don't want to become a potentially responsible party under CERCLA. We will then be splitting some percentage responsibility cost of everything. But the moment that happens, under the FUD program, we will not be allowed to execute. This whole project will go dead. And the lawyers will go. We will come out of our hand until the Department of Justice directs us what to do. So to protect you, that's why we're trying to communicate.
Yes.
And the ELUR is kind of a little baby example. It represents a parcel not much bigger than this road. And the Project 09 work that's going forward, we don't know what the remedy is going to look like for that, but the acreages are bigger. We would not just assume all of the parcel or all of the acreage is equally impacted. We will do what we reasonably can to restrict whatever the remedial actions look like. And we're not at that place yet. We can't tell you what that's going to look
If,
like. I may not have answered.
no,
your
no,
question.
no, no, actually, you did.
Oh,
If say that-
stormwater.
Yep.
The stormwater impacts. I have heard, both through the master planning discussion, that there's talk about, I think your contractor doing the master plan update actually talked to me and Darrell for over an hour, and we conveyed all of these concerns to them. They were talking about, oh yeah, we're going to cap off those storm drain pipes that feed the water into Little Nenny Pond. If I was working as your consultant, don't touch those storm drains. Don't touch a thing. That's me. If I was your environmental consultant, I would tell you, do not touch that infrastructure unless you have to. And if you have to, please communicate.
And I'm just going to jump in, just to be clear, this council has not seen that plan. And I only keep saying this because there's so much misinformation out in the public that we're trying to put a cap on what's happening out there, because that plan that you guys spoke to the consultants about has not come to this council. So we
Okay.
don't know what's in that final plan. It's not even completed yet. So and if we
I can
could-
appreciate that clarification. We did. So the Army Corps was present at that meeting back in, I forget when.
January.
Thank you. 30 January. Due to time constraints, we didn't have time to get up and speak or present, but that was the impetus for this meeting and for communicating these concerns. We do not want the town to take some action unknowingly in the betterment or improvement of your property and then have assumed this risk and environmental liability unknowingly. So that's why we're here.
So we appreciate that, because like I said, we haven't seen it, and the final draft has not been completed, so hopefully they took your recommendations and incorporated them in the plan.
I hope. And I'll go a step further. You didn't ask it, but I'll go there. This goes to the groundwater as well. Greg alluded to it. We are currently monitoring your public supply wells, and where it exceeds 70, or even if I saw the trend line, if you're below 70, but I believe technically, I'm uncomfortable, we have the authority to put treatment on that. If next year you put in a new drinking water well, you start putting in a bottled water plant over there, and you start significantly modifying how groundwater is moving, where the contaminant distribution is or is not, the fudge program may not be allowed. We may not be able to put treatment, or you may have bought some of the liability.
And just,
So that's
and I have to say this because
for you to be aware.
tomorrow we're going to be reading online that the council's putting in a bottle plant in
No.
Ninigret Park.
No. That was my hypothetical.
Thank you.
Yes.
It'll be online tomorrow.
No.
Yes. And it's
They
gonna
will,
cost,
they
yeah.
will. Somebody's watching this right
I'm
now.
sorry.
Oh,
Counselor Stokes.
what I was getting at too is if, we've always talked about in other areas of the town that our percentages and our impervious versus our pervious surfaces and our recharge and things like that. So if the pavement, like in these large sections of pavement that are there, the cracked pavement and whatever the degradation over the last X amount of time is, if this is an area that we identified and we came to Army Corps and said, hey, listen, this is something that looks like a priority. We'd like to do this for whatever reason. We want to remove the pavement because we want to get asphalt out of there. Is that something that Army Corps would then be able to potentially look at within your project scopes and say, you know what? Yeah, we can look at this area and verify or not verify. If it does have it, say, hey, that does fall under the floods and we can remediate that with you. Or, it's clear, go ahead and do
No.
something like that.
Thank you for this, because I can conceive of, if I was sitting in your position, much of what you're hearing from us feels restrictive. Like, we have this CERCLA process. It's not very quick. It takes many years. And you're in the position of, we may want to do something with our property. There is opportunity in what we are doing. Because as we march along this CERCLA process and we get to a decision, depending on where it is, we have got to come forward to the public. You are the stakeholder, and the public is invited to hear all of this and comment. If we are aware, let's say hypothetically, through your master plan, I've got all the copies of your existing master plans up to the one that's currently being regenerated. That master plan will be a component of the remedial alternatives that are evaluated. We have got to factor in your intention for your property. So if the intention is recreational use, we want there to be a parking lot. We intend to build it, and the only reason we haven't is because of your ongoing activities. We've got to factor that into our remedy. So there's opportunities where, through our remedial actions, we may be able to work together to get you what you want. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
Very much so,
absolutely.
actually.
But the timeline probably won't be on what you would desire.
Well,
Or yes, sir.
Question for you. Are you aware that Fish and Wildlife ripped up a ton of pavement down there?
Yes,
Where did they take it? Where did they send it?
that's a great. I don't know.
Okay.
And
Just some other Superfund site.
I've been working on this project since I worked at the Corps, even longer than Carol, I think. And I was made aware that through a program, all of that asphalt removal occurred. The Corps may actually have funded into that program as this big one of multiple federal agencies that supported that. I don't know where the asphalt was taken. What happened happened. But that was before they knew what we know now. What we know now is different. So to be protective of you, if you intended to remove some section of asphalt, we would appreciate the conversation as an opportunity to hopefully help. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you said it's going to happen right next to the fire station, where we have concerns is that may be, or looks to be a release area, we might be able to do some analytical testing of the pavement. We're talking about doing that right now. So we may be in the possession of data that you could benefit from for your plan. In the same way, I'm aware there's discussion of putting a walking path meandering around the perimeter of the park. We have background data that was collected under the 08 project that may be beneficial to your understanding of what the soils conditions are for certain parameters in those areas. We will share that data. If it's helpful to you for your planning purposes, that's great.
So we're not planning that.
Yes,
I know it's coming
hypothetically.
from, yeah, I know
Hypothetically.
there's individuals that
So-
are talking about that, but what you say is key because you've got information.
We have data.
Yeah.
And we will have more data. And we might be able to save the town and their contractors hypothetical future expenses.
It's interesting because, you know,
And
we
we want
talked
to
about
share it.
specifically, we specifically talked about the fire station and, you know, again, what the final version when it comes to us will look like from VHB, I don't know. But in the past plans, that was part of moving those event areas away from that to the top corner, you know, north lights.
Yeah, I know.
The
But
top
northern or
yeah,
northeastern.
northeast corner, you know, which, I mean, right now you talk about the fire station area. I mean, that's literally where the stage for Rhythm and Roots Festival is right in front of that. I mean, the fire station's in that chopped down area that you put down on the other side of the hangar, which is over by the basketball courts.
Mhm.
So about, 10 feet forward of that is where that festival is hosted.
Yeah.
And, it's all surface stuff. Nobody's digging holes over there, but the fact of the matter is you have brought up some interesting things. And, me personally, I think these processes, number one, this master plan, you're never going to implement this thing in a year. Like it's talked about. Nobody's putting a bond out for $20 million or $30 million saying we're going to build this thing in a year. This is a multi-year, really multi-decade process that would happen over the course of time, like it's already happened. The 2008 plan, you see how much information is in the 2008 plan, and you see how much was implemented and how much isn't. So that towns, municipals are still governments. So they move just as glacially slow as every other government.
So in that light, there may be opportunity for win-win. your desires, if we're aware of them, and if it merges with the areas and the remedies, maybe opportunities for us to work together.
Well, and that was one of the largest portions of the reason why originally a year ago today, when we just started this process, that we made sure that we wanted the consultants that were specifically tasked to talk to you, to talk to parks, to talk to Fish and Wildlife, and actually sit down and bring you into that process.
We did extensively.
Yeah.
Extensively. How well that's going to carry forward, I don't know.
But what I would like to know is when that does eventually reach this council, I would really like for you to come back and say that, hey, this is what we're looking for, and this is where we participated and not. So we have some of that information.
Okay.
So these longer term plans can be looked at and say, oh, you know, maybe that's not a good spot. Maybe this is a good spot. It's all about, me personally, it's the data and the information is what I'm concerned with. And I like having that so we can work together on these projects. You also have a far, you know, as much as I hate to say it, a far larger pocketbook for remediation efforts than we do. And, you know, you have the federal backing when you do projects, when you go through your pipeline and finally fill out all the paperwork and dot all the I's and do the, you know, 40 billion trees worth of forms, you then, once you're moving, you have a large resource there. And I don't see why we would not have you as that and a participant in it.
There's opportunity. Absolutely. I'm sure. Go for it.
Just to respond to what you just said, Stephen, I mean, really, that's exactly why we want to put some of these safeguards in place, going back to that, and why that open line of communication with any projects on this site as these investigations are ongoing are important, because I know certainly the DEM doesn't want the town to assume liability, because we know the cleanup's not going to happen in that case. So we want to avoid anything that's going to jeopardize this FUDS program moving forward. Like, that is the number one goal here with all of this stuff. We don't want you guys becoming a responsible party, because then this site is just going to sit here derelict, or, you know, down the line, you're not going to have these options. You might not have options for putting on treatment as standards get lower. Right now, they're talking about this Frosty Drew well now going on treatment, because the Rhode Island standard right now, ours is 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 6 PFAS compounds. Well, the draft EPA MCLs for PFAS are in the single digits, and then all of a sudden, all the wells out here don't look too hot. So just keep that in mind. I mean, this is an evolving, emerging contaminant. It's changing, you know, every month there's something new coming out. And, you know, you want to be able to have the Army Corps involved moving forward. They have a program that's fully funded to take care of this site and remediate it, so that whatever future use the town intends is going to be safe to, you know, recreators, residents, whatever it might be, and it's going to be protective of human health and the environment. And that's really what we're trying to get to here. So
Taking a step back to the Frosty Drew well, right now with whatever they're finding there, who's responsible, or who's actually taking care of it? Is it the Army Corps so you guys are funding the?
Yeah, Greg Hensler again, Army Corps. So yeah, that's one of our projects that we plan to do this year, is to install a POET system at the Frosty Drew Observatory to address the PFAS issue.
Thank you.
What's the
Well, we have so we're going to be operating like 6 systems, and 3 of them are on the park. You know, it's the well that supplies the festival, the beach pavilion, which is mostly used for just like washing hands and flushing roads and so forth, and not the front.
What's the current resolution you guys can test for parts per trillion? What is the current?
It depends on the lab. The labs are getting better with 1 and 2. Yeah, but the labs have been getting better just because, you know, as the criteria go down, you know, labs are trying to rush to meet that.
Right, anyone else?
Yes. Well, Tracy said there is opportunity. We are sampling a lot of areas on Ninigret Park. Mainly, we're focused on 3 landfills, the burn pit, and we have this water supply area that we're trying to delineate PFAS. So if we are sampling in an area, we share that data with you, not a problem. But if there's, let's say you want to go and develop somewhere on Ninigret, we haven't taken any samples in that area. We probably aren't planning on taking any samples in that area because, again, it doesn't fall within supposedly the purview that we think is going to give us enough data to be able to delineate our site. We don't need that data. That doesn't preclude the town from doing their own sampling and due diligence, whether if it's want to remove asphalt, concrete, or soil. We just don't want anybody to be moving anything around without having adequate sampling and characterization of that material before it either gets reused somewhere else on Ninigret by the town or gets shipped off site, and make sure it's done properly, because then you assume that liability, whatever happens to it. So that's what we're trying to preclude. We will share any data that we have with you for the areas that we can legally and are authorized under FUDs in order to sample for the delineation purposes of what we're looking for.
Thank you. Do you have something else, Tracy?
Yeah, and I'll give you as an example. The dog park, right, which is very popular. I was unaware that the dog park was even in construction. And the way I found out was when the DPW director gave me authorization to call the town's water well monitoring contractor to get data for the senior center. And when I called that contractor, they assumed I was calling about the dog park wells. And I didn't know what he was speaking about. And he said, oh, well, they smell really bad. They put in these wells and they stink bad, so they can't use them, I think. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know about these wells. But it's that disconnect where things can hypothetically occur on the property where, due to turnover at the council or turnover in town offices, institutional knowledge can be lost, and it can put the town at risk. So that's the ELUR theme, and it's this, let's have open communication to help each other avoid problems.
Right. And it's also,
And share what we know, because if you do want to do a thing, it's your property, you can do it. We'll help you within the bounds that we legally can. If I can acquire data from anybody, if Rhode Island DEM acquires data that we can utilize for this effort, I'm getting it. If the USGS is getting data, and they are, USGS has got a well on your property, they acquire that data. We're going to work with them to utilize that. Saves the taxpayer money. If US EPA or any other agency is acquiring data, we become aware of it, we're going to assimilate that data to the benefit of the project. If it benefits the town, we'll share it.
yeah. And beyond even the ELUR, it sounds like what the council needs to do is adopt a policy for the town with regards to what happens at Ninigret Park and making sure that these things are being done. So it's kind of in addition to, potentially in the LUR.
Sure. You mentioned an unofficial or an unwritten policy of don't dig below a foot.
Yeah.
That's the first I've ever heard of that. If that was
It's good you guys have been digging along.
Yeah.
if that was ever documented as an official policy,
That's why I say it's unofficial.
We-
It's not unofficial.
Sure.
People kind
And
of
there's
know
no
not to dig.
institution, there's no guarantee of institutional
Even
knowledge for that.
surface soil contamination too, so digging, no deeper than a foot could also get you in trouble.
But this is part of the thing. Like if somebody's down there in their clearance, like scrub around the disc golf, they need to come to you and say, hey, we're clearing out, the scrub because we're going to be digging down, maybe a foot to get the roots out, so it's kind of like, where do you
draw the line?
Exactly.
I hear you. And
Yeah.
I would say within, and I'm looking at Carl because he's the guy I coordinate with and he does much of it. And we met today and I showed him a physical safety hazard, an open storm drain that a homeowner identified to us. And in walking through the margins of the property, there's residual coal laying on the ground from coal piles that the Navy used and left residual there. There's scrap metal. There's old drum carcasses lingering out in the woods. I don't mean to scare anybody, but you have acquired from the government an old Navy base. We don't know exactly what they did everywhere, every day. You as the property owners, and we see it, the hunters and the fishermen bring to the police department live ordnance occasionally. Unfortunately, they don't tell the police where they got it from. But if Carl, through his work, or the public, through their activities, identifies hazards, please, especially if it looks like live ordnance, leave it, take a picture of it, and notify the police, the town, where it is. It might be related to some of these other MMRP projects, which are not on the front burner, but are on our queue to work on. We need to know if people are finding bombs and bullets. We need to be aware of that because it goes into that future work. What is perceived as perhaps a lower priority project, maybe through our education and awareness, elevates up. The other point I wanted to make is, earlier I mentioned this is the first in FUDs authorized to look at PFAS even. Well, that makes this, and you are one of the highest priority FUDs projects nationwide. So if that helps understand, while the budget has to be spread across the country and New England gets an allotment, this project is in the top 10 for the program nationwide. So we are a higher priority, if that helps with speed.
Well, and the, you know, and the, just the easiest outset of things that you hear and you listen to, you know, it's been talked about before. We've talked about the invasive species that are basically taking over that area of the park.
Yes.
Well, that's a problem for us and for the ecosystem, but it's also, I would imagine, a problem for you to get to your sites that you need to get to. And
yes, it was
so,
hard.
You know, if there's an effort in the future to do something like that, where we look at going in there and starting some aerial removal of these invasives, it seems like that would be a good opportunity to work with the Army Corps and say, hey, listen, you know, is any of this in your future movement where you're going to be? And, you know, can that be beneficial to us?
What was that, Nick? I'm sorry, we can't hear.
Sorry, Nick. I don't mean to
just can't hear.
exclude the
No.
EM. I just, yeah.
Tracy can answer it just as well, but I was just going to say, like, what you're talking about there, like, let's say, you know, like Tracy said, and everyone said, we don't know exactly some of these Project 09 sites, like what the remedy is going to look like in the future. But if it is clearing and capping or anything like that, then there's a potential, you know, revegetation plan, and that's where the town would have input in. You know, that would be paid for as part of the remediation process. So, you know, timelines could be long, but in the long run, you might get what you want in certain areas just based off the contamination that's there and what needs to be done to remedy it. And that happens everywhere. I mean, that's not unique here. I mean, there was just a pretty significant project. This was that the Army Corps did in East Providence, where it was an old shooting range, and there was berms. Basically, it's a park. It's right on the 10-mile river bike trail, and they cleared acres and acres of land where these old berms were for this shooting range. They had targets set up every 100 yards up to like 800 yards. And the piles, the berms, the sand berms with all the bullets in them were spread out. There was lead everywhere. So they went in and dug out an extensive area, so acres of land, basically. And then they went to the town and said, this was forest. What do you want it to look like now? And they worked with the town and came up with a reforestation plan with exactly what trees they wanted where, what areas they wanted open spaces. And that was all part of the restoration. So with that, they kind of got what they wanted effectively on a parcel that otherwise was just kind of, you know, sitting there unused, and there was still some debris and other things around. So that's a potential opportunity moving forward with some of these areas.
Thank you. Councilor Cooper.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for your presentation, for coming here, for the discussion. It's very, very important. And I know that it's been a long road with us, I suppose. But I think there was, you know, some really good interchange here tonight. I feel strongly that the ELUR is just the most straightforward way to do that, you know, to begin that institutional knowledge. But either way, I think it was productive for the entire council to hear all of this. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time and the effort.
Right, so, yes?
Thank you for inviting us and having us here this evening. And, you know, we know that there is a master plan that's ongoing, and it sounds like it hasn't been brought to the council's attention. But, I mean, there are projects associated with that, construction of, you know, structures and so forth. I don't know if now's the time if you have any questions for us about it.
Right, so I was going to do my recap, but Councilor Cooper beat me to the punch on that. But just with regards to the master plan, it's like the one thing that I think is important that people know is the master plan is just a guideline. It is not a construction plan where this is what we're going to do. And if you look back at the plans going back to 2008 and the one that wasn't implemented in 2014, most of what was in there was never done. I couldn't even really point to anything that was in that plan that was actually accomplished. So there's a fear out there that this plan is going to get approved and what is in that plan is going to be built. You know, there's going to be bonds floated and this stuff is going up. It's supposed to be coming to us within the next couple days. My last conversation with the Parks and Rec was it's almost done. It's supposed to be coming to the council. And then that will be the first time we're seeing it. I don't know what's in their final plan. I think we need to start calling it something other than a master plan, maybe a guideline, because I think the word plan is scaring people out in the public. And there's enough, I'll say, misinformation out there where people have successfully done that. They have instilled the fear in people that, you know, the council's building a community center, the council's, you know, digging up this, the council's building this, and we haven't even seen anything. So there is no plan at this point for the council to actually do anything. The first thing we need to do is get the draft master plan from the consultants and then look through it. And what we should do is obviously get draft copies out to the people that we specifically requested be included in the process. And when we made our original motion on this, Army Corps of Engineers was one of the individuals. I don't think we had DEM in there, so apologies for that. But we did have the Army Corps in there because, you know, we recognize the importance of what's going on. So we haven't seen it. When we get the draft, we'll make sure you get a copy so that way you can see if your recommendations were implemented in there. And if not, you know, there'll be the opportunity for comment because the council will be having a meeting where we will be setting the record straight on what it is and what it is not. So we completely appreciate all the information you provided tonight. This was extremely beneficial, I think, for all of us. And, yep, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I just want to confirm, so once you have the plan, we have an opportunity to just comment on it?
So absolutely. So once we get it, we will be having a public meeting where there will be copies available and everybody will have the opportunity to comment. And just because this is what they're presenting to us does not mean it's getting a stamp of approval and, you know, boom, this is what's happening. So there was some misinformation out there as to what this whole process was. Okay. And there will be the opportunity for people to comment on that.
And so,
Councilor Sarah?
And we as a council, once we receive this draft, we could be altering the draft into what the council could agree is what we're looking at.
Okay.
As a master plan. So there's more steps for us to.
Yeah, so I just wasn't really sure on time scale, but it seemed to be presented to me that there were going to be some statues going up rather soon.
Oh, so the trolls.
Yes.
The trolls are wooden
trolls,
structures. Yeah. Did you want to talk about the trolls tonight while you're
Which
here?
were shown in the master plan presentation.
Right.
Hence the thought that portions of the master plan are definitely on a faster track than potentially. So
the trolls are wooden structures. They're not implanted in the ground. They're actually made out of pallets and wood, and they sit on top. So the only movement that might be going on is where the boulders are, over where the town has been dumping boulders and moving things for years. There might be some movement of boulders within that area.
Okay, yeah, because I just want to, stress, just kind of going back to our slides about, the Army Corps just has concerns because like one of the trolls is within the Charlestown landfill area, which we kind of, explained in our presentation. Right. And, just to be kind of restrictions, I guess you have to kind of be aware of there with digging. But also there was a trail that was proposed, I think was kind of in very conceptual phase when it was presented to us, that would go through a portion of the Charlestown landfill, which through a portion that we have not yet investigated. So I just want to make sure that town council is aware of that.
Right. So our town administrator, Jeff Allen, we know has been in communication with regards to locations. And I mean, obviously, we're not going to put anything where there's a contaminated area or there's a problem. So if a trail, it's conceptual. There is no trail there now. So the thought was, to go a certain way. If the trail needs to be rerouted to get there in a safer way, obviously that can happen. And just kind of going back to the master plan again with the locations of the troll, we know the one kind of across from Little Ninny Pond, that one, there doesn't seem to be any issue. But again, this is not a construction plan. It's not like you're going out for a school bond saying we're going to build, 15 classrooms with this and this. It's a concept. you know, it's a guideline. So there's nothing in that plan that is set in stone where, and again, I go back to, you look at the plan from 2008, where they talked about doing things. I can't even point to anything in that plan that was actually constructed. And then I'll take a step further with regard to the multipurpose trail. That wasn't in the master plan for 2008, yet here it is in the park. We've got our outdoor exercise area that was not in the master plan, but now it is in the park. So I think we need to stop calling it a master plan and start calling it a guideline or something, because I think that more accurately reflects what this really is.
But you're trying to stress that whatever happens, whether it's in the master plan or a new initiative, consultation would be important and beneficial for the town.
That's correct.
Yeah. And I'll just follow up on that. Our town administrator has been in communication, so we don't want to leave anybody with the impression that they're not in communication. Would you agree?
Absolutely. So we've been there twice with Encore.
Francis, stopping again. Those trolls, do they require anchoring?
I don't believe so. So listen, I'm not the artist.
No.
I'm not the builder.
I'm just,
But whatever, because I know now it's going to be out on the internet that, you know, they're doing this and the trolls are going to be floating through the air. So we know how that goes.
no, but
Yeah.
anchoring would require,
So
yeah, I just wonder.
absolutely. So whatever is done,
Please put that.
we're going to have troll kites out there
Trolls
now.
floating in the
So
air. Please.
you have no idea. Wait till tomorrow. So we can say this, whatever we're going to do, we are already in communication, and we will continue to be in communication with the Army Corps.
That's great, because you mentioned the exercise area near the tennis courts.
Yeah.
You know, I wasn't aware of that. No one at the Corps was aware of that. The multi-use trail went over one of our monitoring wells that was from the boiler house investigation. We weren't aware of that. Those activities, if they occur prior to our awareness of an environmental issue, right? You didn't do it. The town did not construct a thing intentionally or move material intentionally, knowingly. That's what we're looking to avoid going forward, because where we're at now with this PFAS issue, the levels that we are likely to have to address, the footprint of that area is in the town's park area. The water supply well area, the edges of the pavement itself potentially. These things are questions, and I don't have the answers yet for you. So please, let's just communicate.
Right. And so what we're finding is in the past, the communication was lacking, and now we're all in the same room, and we're going to make sure that that problem
good.
does not continue when we
Thank you.
correct it going forward. So did you have something, Council Sarah?
Yeah, of course. Now, does PFAS embed itself into pavement and stay there for a while?
I don't
Over the
know.
long term?
I don't know.
Okay.
I want to be able to answer that. That means I need to collect data, but I haven't yet. So that is.
So this PFAS stuff nationwide is quite new then?
It is an emerging contaminant. That's the kind of bucket. The science on it is changing rapidly. Nick mentioned every month there's a new situation. This project being high priority, all of this work is being coordinated with our national level experts. We're discussing monthly, if not bi-weekly, PFAS related issues on all our projects and programs, both active, airports, military facilities where we have AFFF foam in the fire suppression system now. How do we replace this material? What do we do to sites like this that are more aging? If you know more, I'm learning every day.
I'll add to your concrete question, because that's a great question. I can tell you right now, at Naval Station Newport, for instance, the fuel terminal facilities there was a lot of foam infrastructure, and the Navy was going to go ahead and demolish some buildings out there and leave the slabs in place. Some of these contained foam tanks inside, you name it. They stored foam, and they've since decided to not go that route because they could potentially be creating a bigger issue if they're knocking down those structures that now have a roof over them, leaving these slabs basically exposed to the environment. Because what we generally know about concrete is it acts like a sponge. And PFAS is water soluble. So if the water gets into the concrete, the PFAS can get into the concrete. And PFAS does not degrade, it doesn't break down. It's known as a forever chemical. So if there's definitely the potential that's out there, and I think generally the science is pointing towards it could be an issue. There's just not really methods right now where we can reliably analyze concrete and compare it to standards, but it's definitely a potential source for PFAS.
Well, that's why I asked about asphalt, actually, because I knew about the concrete.
Oh, you did?
About
Okay. I was seriously asphalt. Yeah. So asphalt, similar-ish, but not quite. Yeah.
Yeah, and I am aware of a project, an Army project for a military facility where concrete and asphalt from this area, one area, were demolished, but not kept separate. Many areas from all over a big military base, similar concrete and asphalt, all brought to one big aggregate collection. Then the discovery of the PFAS was found at one of the areas. That blacklisted the whole pile, and that generated hundreds of millions of dollars of cost above and beyond. So, yeah, it's a very real concern. Carol mentioned and want to meet just to make sure, while we're in the RI, before we understand the nature and the risk of potential contaminants, when Greg mentions the construction of a troll statue in a place, even if you're not disturbing the ground beneath, if you're encouraging the public to come and recreate there, then that is a risk that we can't give you an answer on today because we haven't finished the investigation. So that's part of that concern. I can't tell you where it is a good place to have the public walk or a bad place to have the public walk. There's some places it's pretty obvious. You know, 1,000-pound bomb casing and old rusty metal and places I wouldn't encourage the kids to go play out there. But I can't give you an answer about chemical constituents that you can't see. So there's that concern.
Thank you. Yeah.
Or buried munitions.
The concern is if you're going to clear a trail to get to a troll and it's on Charlestown landfill, you're going to have to clear the brush, the grass, the shrubs, whatever. When we clear something on Charlestown landfill, we have an ordnance specialist that is in attendance to make sure that if we encounter anything on the surface, that we avoid it and that they make sure that it's an inert item and it's not a live item. So we just don't take a brush hog and go out there and just clear vegetation. Then if you're going to clear a path, that's one thing. But then you're going to have people walking over that path. If you haven't done geophysics to see what is buried beneath that path that potentially could be harmful for someone, you know, ordnance of some sort, then you're clearing a path and allowing people to go there. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because you said we're not digging. It's not just digging somewhere that exposes someone potentially to a risk. A troll on the surface, that's fine. If you're going to put it where the boulders are, that's probably fine because of the boulders, we can't do geophysics there. We hadn't planned on doing geophysics there. We hadn't planned on doing soil sampling there. But we are more concerned with the path that you're going to take through the landfill without investigating that path is what the concern is.
And there's no path set in stone, so that's...
I understand that.
Right.
But again, it's it's all on the surface.
Right.
You're clearing vegetation.
Yep, and this is all good information. So now we know like exactly what the concern is. So the concern isn't with the boulders and the troll possibly sitting on a boulder. The concern is with the path getting to the troll.
Right. Or moving or dragging the boulders somewhere where you're disturbing the soil beneath it, you know, so, yeah.
Good information.
Oh.
Yes,
Right.
Councilor Stokes.
I know it may sound like a nuance. The bomb casings that we removed, inert, thankfully, munitions debris, those were on the ground surface. 2 or 3 of them, the technicians moved leaf litter out of the way. We have not investigated the subsurface. That means in the leaf litter. Determining whether it's the tip of a potentially live munition, when all I can see is a rusty brown thing in the brown leaves. If you're dragging a rock, a boulder, which I've heard from folks, and I believe there's correspondence that I've seen in prior public meetings where the area of that boulder pile may contain buried munitions. The extent of our geophysical survey to date extends up to the edge of it, and it shows a metallic signature on the perimeter of that boulder pile. So if you hire some contractor to pick up a boulder and move the boulder, yes, he could pick it up and he could swing it over and he could carefully put it down. Would you want him to drag it through the ground? Would you want him to put it down heavily in an area where there may be buried munitions?
Well, that's,
I would not recommend it.
but that's kind of a problem because we've been moving boulders down there for the past 30 years.
That's my
Nobody-
understanding.
Yeah, so
That's my understanding.
and it's like, that's a concern because if there is something there, then for the past 30 years, we've been jeopardizing the lives of the people that we've had down there. So that's a concern, you know, regardless of whether
I
a
hear
goal
you.
goes there or not.
I hear you,
And
which is why
perhaps
when
we
he
should-
discovered this troll thing was about to happen this month or next month, that's when people started scrambling to come and communicate and coordinate.
Yeah, but again, for 30 years, we've been jeopardizing people. That concerns me too.
I hear you. I hear you. And in the same way, it was a concern when we had to clear vegetation where it was a wall of very unsightly vegetation and the public was not going, or low probability they were wading through a sea of greenbriers. And we went in to clear that to execute our investigation. It then exposes an area to the public where there are people whose websites our contractor found where they're encouraging, go on out there with your metal detector. Come on out here and see the old military stuff. We want to be very careful while we're doing the investigation not to encourage the public to go out and wander about or look for souvenirs. Because some of those souvenirs could be hazardous.
Are they doing that at Ninigret that you know of? Like, is there anything directing people there? That you're aware of?
I'm sorry?
They've been doing that for years. Since
I know some people definitely do go out and do it.
Yeah.
I happen to have a map of any underground tunnel. That would be fantastic. That's a 30-something year childhood thing that we would rumor. If you want to, you don't have to share that with everybody, but I would like to know. Yeah. We'll talk later.
I don't have it, but if you do, all ears.
Well, they've been capped.
Yeah.
So they're still
You
there.
have something?
It's actually there, it's too bad so many people have passed on days, because I knew people that worked there.
I agree. I agree. And
They knew a ton of stuff.
And in this community, I will say, this community, I find it a pleasure to come here and work. There's some wonderful people here that I interact with. And they have been a treasure trove of information. To have an individual like a Larry Webster, who has a database of every aircraft wreck, not here, in New England, has been a savings to the taxpayer on other projects that Carol has worked on. He's been able to identify things that other people could not. He's given us a map.
Did you know of anything that was buried in ordnance fire? Larry? Because I know he's the
Yes,
guy.
yes,
Supposedly there's two Corsairs.
yes, but I'm not going to put it on your town meeting.
So, but I heard I also heard there's two Corsairs buried in the dump.
They're on that map that was up there.
Okay,
Yeah.
so,
So your
Thank
community is a wealth of information.
Yeah.
But yeah, we don't want to encourage treasure hunters in there.
makes sense. But no, it's seriously, thank you to all of you for coming out again and going through all this information. This was extremely informative, and getting a lot of this information out there in the public is extremely helpful as well. If you could give us a copy of your PowerPoint presentation so that way we can make it part of the minutes. And that way going forward, if somebody wants to know what was discussed, it's all right here and they don't have to sit here and watch a 3-hour meeting to find out, what was said. So I appreciate it. And I know you guys have been out here a lot, and I'm sure, you're kind of getting a little fed up and disgusted with Charlestown and saying, just, sign the dang thing already. But, we have to do our due diligence too, and this is part of the whole process. So, Mr. Nunes, if you could get that document to our solicitor so he can review it, and then once he's had the opportunity to look that over, we'll schedule another meeting. We won't go through a whole presentation, and we'll take a vote on going forward, with the ELR, yes or no, whatever the council decides based on the information. And in the meantime, we can look through the draft, because you're saying that what is highlighted in the bold is not necessarily required from the council.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so in that draft, and there's always leeway, it's not set in stone, but basically that draft, anything that's in bold, there's options in there, like the property versus contaminated site, and that will be catered to the specific site. Also, the restrictions in there, not all of them are pertinent to this particular site. There's stuff in there about impervious surfaces and infiltration. That wouldn't be applicable to this particular area.
So the DEM does not require this in its entirety. So if the council decided to strike certain sections from this that were not relevant, like if, with regards to if we had an existing facility there with a well or something like that, whole section could be stricken from it. And to have an environmental scientist
Yes,
required to do it, we can
that we could strike,
that.
absolutely, yeah. Yeah, sir, as far as the restrictions themselves, I mean, those are going to be dictated by what's out there. So like exposure to soils and, disturbance of soils, things like that. But yeah, if there's certain things, you can definitely run it by us. I mean, there's definitely some latitude, but some of the things like the annual inspections and stuff like that, that's not really up for debate. But yeah, if you have any concerns about any piece of that at all, we'd be happy to communicate with you on that and get you in touch with our legal offices. We can go have a separate meeting if that's appropriate with the solicitor or whatever you think is necessary.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So thank you. So what we'll do is we'll get that document from you and then we'll set up a second meeting to go through all that. Does that sound reasonable to the council?
Yes.
Anyone have anything else? All right, then hearing nothing, does anyone wish to make a motion to adjourn?
Make the motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion from Counselor Sarah, second from Counselor Cooper. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned at 9:07. Thank you guys very much.